Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you're here tonight. Find somewhere comfortable, lower the volume to whatever feels right, and let the day begin to settle behind you. Maybe you are listening from bed. Maybe you're sitting on a couch with the lights turned low. Maybe this is playing through your headphones while the rest of the house has already gone quiet. Wherever you are, take a moment and think about the street outside your home. At this hour, is it silent? Can you hear cars passing? Are there people walking under streetlights? Would you feel comfortable opening your front door and standing outside for a few minutes? Tonight, we're going to Los Angeles, but not the Los Angeles that usually appears in travel advertisements. We are not going to Hollywood Boulevard, the beaches of Santa Monica, the studios of Burbank, or the expensive houses above Sunset Boulevard. We're going several miles south of downtown, into neighbourhoods that most visitors passed without seeing, and that many city leaders discussed mainly when something had already gone wrong. Our story begins during the late 1970s and continues through the early 1990s. During those years, parts of south-central Los Angeles became divided by gang territories, personal feuds, drug markets, police operations, and a growing supply of firearms. The lines between neighbourhoods were rarely marked on official maps, but local residents knew where they were. A person could cross one of those lines without noticing and still face consequences. A teenager could wear the wrong colour, attend the wrong school, speak to the wrong person, or simply be mistaken for someone else. For thousands of families, this was not a story they watched on television. It was the place where they lived. Before we begin, tell me where you are listening from tonight and what time it is there. I always find it remarkable that people can listen to the same story from different cities, different countries, and completely different hours of the day. And if this kind of calm, detailed history is something you enjoy, you can subscribe and give the video a like. There is no need to interrupt what you're doing. Do it whenever you feel ready. Now let us begin with an ordinary evening in Los Angeles in 1988. The exact street does not matter because versions of this evening were happening across South Central. It could be near Florence Avenue. It could be west of Central Avenue, south of Manchester, close to Crenshaw, or near one of the large public housing developments in Watts. The houses are mostly small one-storey buildings. Many have narrow driveways, metal fences, barred windows and porches facing the street. There are palm trees, utility poles, parked cars, corner stores, churches, schools, repair shops, liquor stores and vacant lots. The weather is mild. The sky is still bright enough to see the outlines of downtown in the distance. A city bus moves along the main road. Someone is washing a car in a driveway. Children are riding bicycles. A radio is playing inside a nearby house. A woman carries grocery bags from her car while watching the sidewalk more carefully than she might admit. Nothing about the scene looks like a battlefield. There are no trenches, there are no military uniforms, there are no official checkpoints, no government has declared war, and no foreign army has entered the city. Yet many residents have developed habits normally associated with places where sudden violence is expected. Parents tell children which streets to avoid. Teenagers learn which bus stops are considered safe. Drivers slow down before turning a corner because they want to see who is standing there. Families move furniture away from front windows. Some residents sleep on the floor during especially violent periods because a mattress below the window line offers more protection than a bed. A loud car approaches and several people look up. That reaction is important. It tells you that danger has become part of the routine. The car may continue without incident. Most cars do. But by the late 1980s, the possibility of a drive-by shooting had become familiar enough that the sound of an engine slowing near a group of young people could cause an immediate response. Someone might step behind a wall, someone might move toward a doorway, a mother might call her children inside. A few seconds later, the car is gone, and the street returns to normal. The problem is that normal has changed. To understand how this happened, we have to resist the simple explanation. It is easy to say that gangs appeared, drugs arrived, and violence followed. That version fits comfortably into a newspaper headline, but it leaves out most of the history. The neighbourhoods of South Central did not suddenly become violent, because one generation of young people made a collective decision to destroy them. Long before crack cocaine, long before automatic and semi-automatic weapons became common in street disputes, and long before the names Crips and Bloods were recognised across the country, these communities had been shaped by racial segregation, restricted housing, industrial change, unemployment, strained schools, and difficult relations with the Los Angeles Police Department. Gang conflict already existed in Los Angeles before the 1970s. Black youth groups had formed in South Los Angeles decades earlier. Some began as social clubs, neighbourhood groups, car clubs, or collections of young men who gathered at dances, skating rinks, housing projects, and local streets. Rivalries developed between neighbourhoods, sometimes over parties, schools, insults, girlfriends, or fights that continued through friends and relatives. Researchers tracing the history of Los Angeles gangs have connected their development to racism, conflict between neighbourhoods, and the conditions inside large housing projects, especially in and around Watts. Those early groups could be violent, but they were generally smaller and more local than what came later. Something began to change near the end of the 1960s. The Crips emerged during this period, most commonly associated with Raymond, Washington, and young people in South Los Angeles. The exact story of the name, the earliest membership, and the organisation's original purpose has been argued over for years. Memories differ. Former members tell conflicting versions. Police accounts and community accounts do not always agree. What is clear is that groups using the Crip identity expanded quickly during the early 1970s. The name was adopted by young men in different neighbourhoods, but this did not produce one unified organisation with a single leader issuing instructions across the city. It produced many separate neighbourhood groups, later widely called sets. That distinction matters. When people outside Los Angeles heard the word Crips, they often imagined one enormous gang operating under a central command. On the ground, however, the reality was fragmented. A Crip set in one neighbourhood could be friendly with another set, neutral toward it, or openly at war with it. Shared colours and names did not guarantee cooperation. Local loyalties often mattered more than the larger identity. As Crip-affiliated groups expanded, rival neighbourhood gangs faced pressure. Some began cooperating for protection. Groups including the Pyrus and Brims became part of the loose alignment that came to be known as the Bloods. This was also not a single organisation in the conventional sense. Blood identity connected numerous sets, but each set had its own territory, history, enemies, and internal relationships. By the late 1970s, the basic structure of the conflict was in place, but the structure was more complicated than two armies facing one another. It was not simply Crips on one side and Bloods on the other. Crip sets fought Blood sets. Blood sets fought Crip sets. Crips sometimes fought other Crips, and Blood sometimes fought other Bloods. Individual disputes could become neighbourhood disputes. A fight at a school could lead to retaliation outside a house. A shooting could produce another shooting days, weeks, or months later. The original participants might eventually disappear, but younger friends and relatives inherited the obligation to respond. In this system, memory became dangerous. A neighbourhood remembered who had been killed. Families remembered who had been injured. Young men remembered humiliations, beatings, funerals, and names painted on walls. Retaliation was often described as loyalty. Refusing to retaliate could be interpreted as weakness, and weakness could invite further attacks. None of this means that every young person in these neighbourhoods belonged to a gang. Most did not. Most residents were workers, parents, children, students, retirees, shopkeepers, church members, and people trying to manage ordinary lives. Even on blocks with a strong gang presence, the gang represented only part of the population. But a small number of armed people can control the behaviour of many unarmed people. Consider what that meant for a teenager who was not involved. He might attend school with students from several neighbourhoods. He might have cousins connected to one group and friends connected to another. He might live on a street claimed by a gang he never joined. Someone from a rival area might assume he belonged simply because of where he lived. Now consider what it meant for his mother. She could warn him not to stand outside. She could tell him to come home before dark. She could ask who he was with and where they were going. She could move to another apartment if she had the money, if a landlord accepted her application, and if another neighbourhood was actually safer. Most families did not have unlimited choices. The city often described gang territory as if it belonged to gangs. Residents knew better. These were their homes. The same street identified in a police report as gang-controlled might contain a grandmother who had lived there for 30 years, a mechanic who opened his shop before sunrise, a teacher preparing lessons at her kitchen table, and children who knew nothing about the conflict except the instructions adults gave them. Stay away from that corner. Do not walk home alone. Do not stare at people in passing cars. Get inside when the streetlights come on. Drop to the floor if you hear shots. These were not official rules. They were practical knowledge, passed from one person to another because practical knowledge could keep someone alive. Los Angeles had been dealing with rising homicide long before the worst years of the crack era. The city's homicide rate increased from 12.5 per 100,000 residents in 1970 to 23 per 100,000 in 1979, an increase of 84% over the decade. Nearly 5,000 criminal homicides were recorded in Los Angeles during the 1970s. The risk was not distributed evenly. Young men and minority residents faced much higher rates of victimization than the citywide average. Those numbers tell us that the crisis did not begin in 1985. By the time crack cocaine appeared on the streets in large quantities, many neighborhoods were already carrying years of unresolved violence. Gang identities were established. Territorial disputes had histories. Trust in the police was weak. Economic conditions were deteriorating. The drug market entered an environment that was already unstable. This is where the story is often simplified again. Crack cocaine did intensify the crisis. It created new opportunities for profit, brought more cash into street-level drug sales, and contributed to competition over locations where drugs could be sold. Money could be used to buy cars, hire lawyers, support imprisoned associates, and obtain weapons. Law enforcement reports from the period described some Crip and Blood factions participating in rock cocaine trafficking and using drug income to increase their influence. But it would be wrong to claim that every gang dispute was about drugs, or that crack alone caused the homicide increase. Studies of Los Angeles homicides between 1986 and 1988 found that gang-motivated killings were often separate from narcotics-motivated killings. Gang homicides could begin with territory, identity, retaliation, personal disputes, or long-running rivalries rather than a fight over drug profits. Researchers also found that the rapid rise in crack sales from 1983 to 1985 was not initially dominated by gang members. The drug economy poured fuel into the situation, but the ground was already burning. Return to the street in 1988. The sun has gone down now. Porch lights have come on. Curtains have been closed. A helicopter can be heard several blocks away, though no one on this street knows exactly why it is there. Its searchlight moves across rooftops, yards, and walls. The helicopter is another part of the environment. For residents, danger did not come only from gang members. The LAPD responded to rising violence with increasingly aggressive tactics. Large-scale sweeps placed officers into neighborhoods in significant numbers. Young men were stopped, searched, questioned, ordered against walls, or detained while police tried to identify gang members and locate weapons. Some residents welcomed a stronger response because they were exhausted by shootings. They wanted dealers removed from corners and armed groups kept away from their homes. Others believed that police operations treated entire neighborhoods as suspect. A person could fear gang members and distrust the police at the same time. That position was common, but it was difficult to explain to outsiders. People wanted protection without humiliation. They wanted officers to respond quickly to shootings without assuming that every black teenager was a criminal. They wanted gang violence taken seriously without having their homes damaged during raids or their sons stopped repeatedly because of clothing, location, or appearance. The conflict placed residents between two forms of power. One was informal and territorial. It came from young men who claimed blocks, controlled corners, and enforced reputation through violence. The other was official and heavily armed. It came with badges, patrol cars, helicopters, warrants, arrest powers, and the authority of the state. Most residents controlled neither. Imagine trying to raise a child inside that situation. You explain that the police are supposed to help, but you also teach the child how to behave during a stop. Keep your hands visible, do not argue, answer clearly, move slowly. You explain that gang members are dangerous, but some of those gang members may be relatives, classmates, neighbours, or children you remember from elementary school. Nothing fits neatly. A boy involved in a gang may also carry groceries for an elderly neighbour. A police officer who treats one resident respectfully may humiliate another person 2 streets away. A family may call the police after a shooting and then refuse to identify the gunman because they fear retaliation, distrust investigators, or both. When officials described a lack of cooperation, they often interpreted silence as approval of gangs. Residents understood silence differently. Speaking could place an entire family in danger. Witness protection was limited, and a person who identified a shooter might continue living within walking distance of the shooter's friends. Silence was not always loyalty. Sometimes it was fear. A few houses down, a family finishes dinner. The television is on, but the volume is low enough that adults can still hear what is happening outside. One child is doing homework, another is asleep on the couch. The father checks the lock on the front door. The mother looks through the curtain after hearing voices near the sidewalk. Then several sharp sounds come from the next block. Everyone in the room stops. People who have never heard gunfire often describe it as unmistakable. It is not always unmistakable. At a distance, a gunshot can sound like a firecracker, a car backfiring, or a piece of lumber being dropped. Experience teaches the difference, but even experienced residents may wait for another sound. There are 3 more shots. The father turns off the lights near the front window. The mother pulls the child away from the couch. No one goes outside. A car accelerates. A dog begins barking. Someone shouts from farther down the street. Within minutes, a police siren approaches. This may be a fatal shooting. It may be an injury. It may be gunfire directed at an empty house or car. The family does not know yet. They only know that the night has changed and that sleep will be more difficult. The next morning, children will still go to school. Adults will still go to work. Buses will run. Stores will open. Someone will sweep broken glass from the pavement. If a person has been killed, candles may appear near the location. Friends may write a name on cardboard, a wall, or a shirt. A funeral will be planned. Then people will wait to see whether another shooting follows. That waiting is one of the most important parts of this history. Violence was not limited to the moment when a weapon was fired. It continued through expectation. It changed routes, schedules, friendships, clothing, sleep, and the way people reacted to an unfamiliar car. It turned ordinary geography into a collection of risks. A park was not only a park, it might be associated with a set. A school was not only a school, it brought students from competing territories into the same hallways. A freeway exit was not only a freeway exit. Taking the wrong turn could place someone in an area where they were recognised or misidentified. A hospital emergency room was not always neutral ground. Friends of victims might arrive angry, while police attempted to control entrances and prevent another confrontation. This is how parts of Los Angeles began to resemble contested territory without ever becoming an official war zone. The word battlefield can easily become sensational. It can make the city sound exciting from a safe distance. There was nothing exciting about a child sleeping in a bathtub because the bathroom had fewer exterior walls. There was nothing glamorous about a mother identifying her son in a hospital. There was nothing impressive about teenagers carrying guns because they believed they would be killed without them. The people living through this period did not need dramatic language. The facts were enough. Over the years ahead, we will follow how neighbourhood groups became larger gang identities, how those identities divided into hundreds of sets, why old disputes survived across generations, how drive-by shootings changed street violence, and why crack cocaine and firearms increased the number of people who could be killed in a few seconds. We will also look beyond the gangs themselves. We need to understand the factories that closed or moved. We need to examine housing segregation and the way black residents had been restricted to particular parts of Los Angeles. We need to consider the legacy of the 1965 Watts uprising, the decline of some community organisations, the expansion of policing, overcrowded jails, struggling schools, and the growing belief among many residents that the government noticed their neighbourhoods mainly when it wanted to punish someone. By the early 1990s, all of these pressures would meet in the same city. Gang violence would reach devastating levels. The LAPD would face national scrutiny. The videotaped beating of Rodney King would become one of the most important pieces of recorded police violence in American history. The acquittal of the officers charged in the case would help trigger the 1992 Los Angeles uprising. But we are not there yet. For now, it is still the late 1970s, and the transformation is happening gradually enough that many people do not understand how far it will go. Raymond Washington and other young men are building the identity that will become associated with the Crips. Rival groups are deciding how to respond. Neighbourhood names are becoming permanent labels. Fights that once involved fists, chains, knives, or improvised weapons are becoming more likely to involve guns. Young people are inheriting conflicts they did not begin. Across South Central, parents are watching these changes from their porches, kitchens, churches, schools, and front windows. They see groups growing larger. They hear new names. They notice graffiti appearing on walls. They begin learning which streets now belong to which set. The city around them continues operating as usual. Downtown buildings rise. Hollywood sells images of California to the world. Tourists arrive looking for sunshine and movie stars. Several miles away, another Los Angeles is taking shape, one block at a time. To understand why young people joined these groups, why the groups spread so quickly, and why so many neighbourhoods became vulnerable to territorial violence, we have to go back further than the Crips and Bloods. We have to begin with the South Los Angeles that existed before their names appeared on walls. When black families arrived looking for industrial jobs, decent homes, and a secure place in the city, only to discover that Los Angeles had already decided where they were permitted to live. The restrictions placed on black families in Los Angeles did not begin with gangs, drugs, or the unrest that would later appear on television. They began with housing. They began with decisions about who could buy a home, who could rent an apartment, which streets were considered open to certain families, and which neighbourhoods would use contracts, intimidation, and financial pressure to keep them out. Los Angeles liked to present itself as different from the older cities of the East and South. It was newer, larger, and still expanding. It did not have the same visible system of segregation associated with Jim Crow laws. There were no signs on every street announcing where black residents were permitted to live. The restrictions were enforced in less obvious ways, but they were still effective. Property owners used racially restrictive covenants, private agreements written into deeds that prohibited homes from being sold or rented to black people, and in many cases to other racial and religious minorities. Real estate agents steered buyers toward neighbourhoods considered suitable for them. Banks restricted mortgages in areas with black residents. White homeowners organised associations to preserve racial boundaries, families who crossed those boundaries could face lawsuits, harassment, vandalism, or threats. Restrictive covenants existed across the United States. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelley v. Kramer that courts could not enforce them, but that decision did not instantly remove residential segregation. Private discrimination continued, and the lending and real estate industries had already helped shape the geography of Los Angeles. The result was that Black Angelenos were concentrated in a limited section of the city, much of it along the Central Avenue corridor. Central Avenue became one of the most important black cultural and commercial districts in the western United States. It contained restaurants, clubs, churches, shops, newspapers, medical offices, and businesses owned by black residents. Musicians performed there. Political organizations met there. Families attended church, bought groceries, visited friends, and built institutions in a city that restricted where they could go. The district was crowded, but it was not empty of opportunity. During the Second World War, Los Angeles became a major industrial center. Aircraft plants, shipyards, rubber factories, steel operations, automobile assembly facilities, and defense contractors required large numbers of workers. Black Americans arrived from Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and other states, joining a broader migration toward western cities. Many came because Los Angeles offered wages that were difficult to earn in the rural South. A factory job could provide a regular paycheck, union membership, and the possibility of supporting a family without depending on agricultural labour. The city offered a future that seemed more stable. The reality was more complicated. Black workers often received the least desirable assignments. Some unions excluded them or placed barriers in their way. Employers could refuse to hire them even during periods of high demand. Housing remained restricted, which meant that a growing population was being directed into a small number of neighbourhoods. A family might find work at a factory several miles away but struggle to find a decent home near it. Apartments became overcrowded. Houses were divided into smaller units. Rents increased because landlords knew that black tenants had limited alternatives. Even so, the post-war years gave many families a level of security that mattered. A parent with a unionized industrial job could pay rent, purchase furniture, support local businesses, and imagine buying a home. Children grew up watching adults leave for shifts at factories that appeared permanent. Nothing about those jobs felt temporary to the families depending on them. The factories were large. The buildings occupied entire blocks. Their parking lots filled each morning. Their whistles and shift changes shaped the schedules of surrounding neighbourhoods. Generations of workers expected that a person could graduate from high school, enter a plant, learn a trade, and remain employed for decades. That expectation became one of the most damaging losses of the period that followed. The black population of Los Angeles continued to grow after the war, and the old housing boundaries came under pressure. Some families moved west from Central Avenue toward neighbourhoods that had previously been white. Others moved south. Watts, once an independent city before being annexed by Los Angeles, became heavily black by the middle of the 20th century. White residents responded in different ways. Some stayed. Some resisted integration through neighbourhood organisations or legal action. Many moved to suburbs or other sections of the metropolitan area. This movement became known as white flight, but the phrase can hide the machinery behind it. White families were often able to obtain federally supported mortgages and purchase new homes in expanding suburban developments. Black families were frequently denied access to the same financing. Real estate agents sometimes encouraged white homeowners to sell by warning them that black families were moving nearby and property values would fall. Investors then purchased homes at reduced prices and rented or resold them to black families at higher costs. The neighbourhood changed, but the public and private investment that had supported it did not always remain. Businesses left. Banks became less willing to lend. Property maintenance declined. Insurance became more expensive or difficult to obtain. Schools received growing numbers of students while resources failed to keep pace. A family could move into a neighbourhood that had once represented upward mobility and discover that the institutions around it were beginning to weaken. This was not because black residents lacked interest in maintaining their homes or communities. It was because property values and public services were affected by policies beyond the control of individual families. A homeowner could repair a roof, paint a fence, and keep a yard clean. That person could not force a bank to lend in the neighbourhood. A parent could support a school, attend meetings, and help with homework. That parent could not replace industrial jobs disappearing across the region. By the early 1960s, frustration in South Los Angeles was already visible. Residents complained about overcrowded housing, unemployment, poor schools, limited transportation, and police conduct. The LAPD had developed a national reputation for efficiency and discipline under Chief William H. Parker, who led the department from 1950 until his death in 1966. Supporters believed he had professionalized the force and separated it from political corruption. Many black and Mexican American residents experienced the department differently. They described frequent stops, disrespectful treatment, aggressive arrests, and officers who behaved as if entire neighborhoods were hostile territory. The relationship was made worse by the structure of the department. Officers often lived outside the neighborhoods they patrolled. The police force did not reflect the racial composition of the city. Residents could encounter officers who had little connection to the community and who arrived expecting confrontation. For young black men, police contact could become a routine part of public life. A group standing outside a store might be questioned. A driver could be stopped and ordered out of a car. A disagreement with an officer could escalate quickly because the officer expected resistance, and the resident expected humiliation. Each encounter added to a larger history. Then came August 1965. The immediate event began with a traffic stop near 116th Street and Avalon Boulevard. A California Highway Patrol officer stopped 21-year-old Marquette Fry on suspicion of drunk driving. Fry's mother and brother arrived. A crowd gathered. The arrest became physical. Rumours spread through the neighbourhood, and anger that had accumulated over years moved into the streets. The unrest lasted 6 days. Buildings burned, stores were looted, police officers, firefighters, National Guard troops, residents and bystanders moved through an area that no longer functioned normally. 34 people were killed. More than 1,000 were injured. Thousands were arrested. Property damage reached tens of millions of dollars. Television viewers across the country saw smoke rising above Watts and heard the event described as a riot. Many residents called it a rebellion. The choice of words revealed how differently the event was understood. To city officials, it was a breakdown of order that required force. To many people in Watts, it was the result of conditions that had been ignored until the streets erupted. Governor Pat Brown appointed a commission led by former CIA Director John McCone to investigate. The commission identified serious problems involving unemployment, education, housing, transportation, healthcare, and police-community relations. It called for investment and reform. Some changes followed. Programs were created. Community groups received funding. The LAPD established a community relations program after the unrest, acknowledging that police-community tensions had contributed to the crisis. The department later reorganized those efforts, but the creation of the program itself showed that trust had become a recognized problem. The deeper economic and social conditions proved harder to change. The late 1960s were also a period of political organization in South Los Angeles. Civil rights groups, churches, neighborhood associations, black nationalist organizations, student groups, and social programs tried to build alternatives to street violence. The Black Panther Party established a major presence in Los Angeles under leaders including Alprentice Bunchy Carter. The organization attracted young people who might otherwise have joined neighborhood gangs. It combined militant political language with community programs, education, and organizing. Other groups offered similar forms of structure. They gave young people meetings to attend, responsibilities to carry, and a larger political explanation for the conditions around them. They argued that poverty and police violence were not personal failures. They were connected to institutions, laws, and economic decisions. This mattered because youth gangs were not the only organisations capable of attracting frustrated young men. A teenager looking for identity could join a political organisation. He could work on a community newspaper, attend a meeting, participate in a breakfast programme, or listen to older activists explain local history. That path did not eliminate violence. Political groups had internal conflicts, and some were involved in armed confrontations. The Los Angeles chapter of the Black Panther Party faced surveillance, infiltration, arrests, and violent conflict with police. Rivalries between political organisations also became deadly. Federal authorities considered black militant groups a serious threat. The FBI's COINTELPRO operations attempted to disrupt them through surveillance, informants, propaganda, and efforts to increase conflict within and between organisations. Local police also placed intense pressure on these groups. In December 1969, the LAPD carried out a major raid on the Black Panther headquarters on Central Avenue. The operation involved the department's recently developed Special Weapons and Tactics Unit. A long gun battle followed before the Panthers inside surrendered. The LAPD's SWAT concept had emerged in the late 1960s, partly in response to armed confrontations and sniping incidents during and after the Watts unrest. It represented a move towards specialised, heavily armed police responses inside the city. For residents, the raid demonstrated how quickly a neighbourhood could become the site of a military-style operation. Police surrounded the building. Gunfire continued for hours. People nearby watched officers carrying specialised weapons through streets where families lived. The Panthers survived the raid, but political organisations in Los Angeles weakened during the early 1970s. Leaders were killed, imprisoned, driven into exile, or consumed by internal conflict. Government surveillance increased distrust. Organisations split into factions. The decline of these groups created an opening. The young people who came afterward inherited the same neighbourhoods, but they had fewer large political organisations capable of absorbing their frustration. They still faced police hostility. They still encountered limited opportunities. They still wanted protection, status, identity, and belonging. Neighbourhood groups became one place to find those things. This did not mean that political organisations disappeared completely, or that every gang member would otherwise have become a political activist. The connection is not that simple. It does mean that the institutional landscape changed. An older teenager in 1968 might have encountered Panthers distributing newspapers or discussing revolutionary politics. A teenager on the same street several years later was more likely to encounter a neighbourhood group whose identity centred on local territory. The focus became narrower. Instead of talking about changing the city, a group might concentrate on defending a block, a park, a school, or a housing project. At the same time, the economy that had supported working-class families was beginning to weaken. Manufacturing did not disappear from Los Angeles in a single year. Plants closed at different times. Some companies moved production to suburbs, other states, or other countries. Some adopted new technology and required fewer workers. Defence spending shifted. Recessions placed additional pressure on industries that had once appeared secure. The national manufacturing sector experienced major job reallocation during the 1970s and 1980s, with plants expanding, contracting, opening and closing at high rates. Changes in technology also altered the balance between production and non-production work. These national shifts were especially damaging in communities that depended heavily on industrial employment and where workers had fewer alternatives. South Central was one of those communities. If factory closure did more than remove a building from the economy, it removed wages from local stores, it reduced union membership, it eliminated jobs that young people could see from their own streets. It weakened the belief that finishing high school would lead to steady employment. Suppose a father had worked in a tyre plant for 20 years. His paycheck supported several people. He paid rent or a mortgage, bought groceries, repaired his car, gave money to his church, and sometimes helped relatives. When the plant closed, all of those activities were affected. If hundreds of workers lost jobs at the same time, the damage spread. A restaurant near the factory lost customers. A barber saw fewer clients. A landlord received late rent. A teenager who expected to follow an uncle into the plant no longer had that option. The remaining jobs were often farther away, paid less, or required education that local schools had not adequately provided. Transportation created another problem. Los Angeles was built around the automobile, but not every household had a reliable car. Public transportation could require long trips and multiple transfers. A job might exist in another part of the county but remain practically unreachable for someone without dependable transportation. Youth unemployment became especially serious. A teenager with no job still needed money for clothes, food, transportation, and social life. Parents under financial strain could not always provide it. The legal economy offered limited entry points. The informal economy was much closer. Before crack cocaine, young people could earn money through small-scale marijuana sales, theft, gambling, stolen property, or other street activity. These markets were not yet producing the extraordinary profits associated with crack, but they created connections between neighborhood groups and illegal income. The local gang offered more than money. It offered recognition. A young man who felt ignored at school, rejected by employers, and targeted by police could become known within a set. He had a nickname, a reputation, and people who claimed to protect him. Older members taught rules, stories, enemies, and expectations. To an outsider, the gang might look like a collection of criminals. To a 13-year-old boy, it could look like the most organised institution on his block. This was one reason suppression alone struggled to eliminate gangs. Arresting members did not remove the conditions that produced new recruits. A group could lose older members and replace them with younger ones who had grown up watching the same conflicts. Housing developments became important locations in this process. Projects such as Nickerson Gardens, Jordan Downs, Imperial Courts and others had been built to provide affordable housing, often for wartime workers and low-income families. Over time, many became isolated from the stronger parts of the regional economy. The buildings were permanent, but public commitment to them was inconsistent. Maintenance problems accumulated. Residents faced concentrated poverty. Young people spent much of their time near other young people experiencing the same limited options. Different developments developed strong local identities. An address became more than a place to live. It became a label. This could build solidarity. Residents watched one another's children, shared food, organised tenant groups, and developed strong relationships. It could also sharpen rivalry with nearby neighbourhoods. Young people from one housing project might fight young people from another at schools, dances, parks, or sporting events. Each confrontation added to an existing reputation. Adults often understood how serious this was becoming before officials did. Teachers noticed students avoiding certain routes. Parents heard new gang names. Ministers conducted funerals for teenagers. Recreation workers saw neighbourhood disputes interfere with sports and youth programs. Still, the city often treated these problems as isolated misconduct. A fight was a fight. A burglary was a burglary. Graffiti was vandalism. Police responded to individual incidents without necessarily recognising the larger system of territory and retaliation taking shape. By the middle of the 1970s, that system had become difficult to ignore. Crip groups had spread beyond the neighbourhood where the name first gained recognition. Rival groups had joined the Blood Alliance. Both identities divided into separate sets. Each set claimed a location and built its own history. The conditions that supported this growth had taken decades to form. Housing segregation had concentrated families in limited areas. White flight and discriminatory lending had weakened investment. Industrial employment had begun to leave. Political organisations that once offered young people a broader identity had been disrupted or had declined. Police community distrust remained unresolved after Watts. None of these forces automatically created gangs. Most people who experienced poverty did not join gangs. Most black teenagers did not become violent. Most residents responded to difficult conditions by working, raising families, organising churches, forming neighbourhood groups and trying to protect their children. History becomes inaccurate when hardship is treated as a simple explanation for criminal behaviour. Poverty does not pull a trigger. Segregation does not order a retaliation. A factory closure does not force someone to join a gang. What these conditions did was make neighbourhoods more vulnerable. They reduced the number of strong institutions competing for a young person's time and loyalty. They made illegal income more attractive. They increased frustration with the police. They concentrated young people in places where territorial identity could spread quickly. Then individual choices operated inside those conditions. A boy decided to join because his brother belonged. Another joined after being beaten on the way home from school. Another wanted status. Another wanted money. Another believed membership was necessary for protection. Some joined because they were afraid of gangs. That may sound contradictory, but it happened. A teenager threatened by a neighbourhood group might join that same group because membership ended the threat and provided protection from rivals. The gang solved a problem that the gang itself had helped create. Once enough young people entered this system, neutrality became harder to maintain. A person who refused to join could still be identified by residence, family connection, or friendship. Entire neighbourhoods acquired reputations based on the actions of a relatively small number of residents. By the end of the 1970s, South Central had not yet reached the levels of violence that would define the late 1980s and early 1990s. Crack cocaine had not transformed the drug economy. Semi-automatic firearms were not yet as common in street conflicts. Drive-by shootings had not reached their later frequency. Many disputes still involved beatings, knives, clubs, chains, or handguns fired at close range. But the essential components were present. There were neighbourhoods separated by racial and economic history. There were young people searching for protection and identity. There were police officers who often viewed those young people as threats. There were families losing access to stable employment. There were territorial groups multiplying faster than community institutions could respond. The next transformation would occur inside the gangs themselves. The Crips and Bloods were becoming famous names, but the names concealed hundreds of smaller organisations. Sets formed, split, changed alliances, and developed their own enemies. A conflict that began between two people could become attached to the identity of an entire neighbourhood. The wider the names spread, the less control anyone had over them. No single leader could call the conflict off. No agreement between two sets could settle every rivalry. Each new group added another border, another history, and another list of people expected to be remembered. South Central was being divided into territories that did not appear on city maps. Most residents could still move through their daily lives without incident, but young people were learning those boundaries carefully. They knew which park belonged to whom. They knew which school brought rivals together. They knew which neighbourhood name could begin a fight. They knew that the Crips and Bloods were no longer simply two groups. They were becoming hundreds. By the beginning of the 1970s, young people across South Los Angeles were hearing the same name repeated in schoolyards, parks, housing projects, recreation centres, and streets that had once belonged to smaller neighbourhood groups. Crips. The name did not arrive everywhere at the same time, and it did not mean exactly the same thing in every neighbourhood. Some young men heard it as a warning. Others heard it as an invitation. For a teenager who already belonged to a local group, it could represent a larger identity and a reputation that reached beyond a few blocks. For someone living in a neighbourhood threatened by Crip members, the name represented an expanding problem that required a response. This was the point when a local organisation began turning into something much harder to define. People often describe the Crips as though they were created with a central office, a fixed chain of command, and a plan to expand across Los Angeles. That is not how the growth occurred. Raymond Washington is widely identified as one of the central figures in the earliest Crip formation around 1969, and Stanley Tookie Williams became associated with another important early group on the west side of South Central. Their personal histories later became surrounded by competing memories, disputed claims, police accounts, interviews, and stories repeated by people who had not been present. What matters most for understanding the expansion is that the name became more powerful than any one person. Washington could influence the young men around him. Williams could influence his own circle. Neither man controlled every group that later used the Crip identity. There was no reliable method for approving a new branch, removing a leader, settling a dispute, or forcing distant members to follow the same rules. A neighbourhood group could adopt the name because it wanted protection, recognition, or a stronger reputation. Another could be absorbed after a confrontation. A third might begin using the identity because young men there had friends or relatives connected to an existing set. Within a few years, groups using Crip names were appearing across South Los Angeles in what researchers later described as an irregular pattern rather than a carefully managed expansion. The process could happen quickly. Imagine a group of 15 or 20 teenagers who already spent time together near a park. They attended the same schools, lived within walking distance of one another, and had fought with young people from a neighbouring area. They might already have a name based on a street, a housing project, or a local nickname. Then the Crip identity reached them. Adopting it could make the group seem more powerful. The young men were no longer only a collection of friends from one block. They were connected, at least in name, to something feared across the city. That fear carried practical value. A small group claiming Crip affiliation might discourage outsiders from entering its area. It could attract younger recruits. It could make rivals hesitate before attacking. The name created an impression of support even when no outside support would actually arrive. The difference between appearance and reality became one of the most important features of Los Angeles gang culture. A set might look like part of a citywide organisation while functioning almost entirely on its own. Members could share a colour, vocabulary, hand signs, and hostility toward blood-affiliated groups, yet have little regular contact with Crips elsewhere. Government descriptions produced in later years repeatedly characterised Crips and Bloods as umbrella identities made up of loosely organised, neighbourhood-oriented factions rather than two unified gangs. That structure allowed rapid expansion, but it created permanent instability. A centralised organisation can negotiate, it can issue orders, it can punish members who violate agreements, it can decide that a conflict is costing too much and bring it to an end. A collection of independent neighbourhood sets cannot do those things easily. Suppose leaders from two Crip neighbourhoods agreed to stop fighting. Younger members might ignore them. A person seeking revenge for a dead friend might continue shooting. Another set using the same Crip identity might have no interest in the agreement. Someone could commit an attack and deny responsibility, leaving the victim's friends to retaliate against anyone associated with the area. There was no dependable authority capable of settling the matter. This is why the word gang can be misleading. It suggests a single organisation when the reality was closer to a collection of local groups that borrowed common symbols while protecting separate interests. The same problem developed among the Bloods. As Crip groups multiplied, smaller gangs that remained independent faced a difficult choice. They could attempt to join the expanding identity, continue defending themselves alone, or cooperate with other neighbourhoods that also felt threatened. Several groups chose cooperation. The Pyrrhus, associated with the area around Piru Street in Compton, became an important part of this response. The Brims and other established neighbourhood gangs also participated in alliances that eventually became associated with the Blood identity. The most widely accepted account describes the Bloods as emerging during the 1970s, when smaller gangs joined together for protection against the larger number of Crip groups. That explanation is useful, but it can make the formation sound more orderly than it was. The Bloods did not gather at one meeting, choose a permanent leader, write a constitution, and divide the city. The identity developed across relationships between existing gangs. Different neighbourhoods joined at different times. Some groups had histories that began before the Blood name existed. Like the Crips, they were an alliance without a central authority strong enough to control every member. The result was a city-wide rivalry made up of smaller local rivalries. A Blood set might be hostile toward nearby Crips while having almost no contact with Crips 10 miles away. Two Crip sets might share a general opposition to Bloods, but remain bitter enemies of each other. Blood sets could also fight one another. The map was not divided neatly into red territory and blue territory. It was divided into blocks, housing projects, parks, apartment complexes, school zones, and commercial streets. Some areas were claimed by large sets with hundreds of members and associates. Others were controlled by groups whose active membership could fit inside a living room. The strength of a set was not measured only by numbers. Reputation mattered. A small group known for responding quickly to attacks could be feared more than a larger but less aggressive one. The number of imprisoned members mattered because prison connections could influence street disputes. Family relationships mattered because one household might connect several neighbourhoods. A set's name usually tied it to a specific location. Some names came from streets, others came from parks, housing projects, districts, or numbers. The name told people where the members were from and where they claimed the right to stand, gather, sell drugs, or move without challenge. Territory was important even before drug profits made certain corners financially valuable. A neighbourhood was a source of identity. It contained childhood homes, friends, relatives, schools, and memories. Defending it could be described as loyalty, even when the defence involved attacking people who had done nothing personally to the defender. The territory did not have to be legally owned. A teenager might live with his mother in a rented apartment and still speak as though the surrounding blocks belonged to his set. The claim came from presence, intimidation, and recognition rather than property documents. Graffiti helped make the claim visible. A name written on a wall announced that a group existed. It identified the set and sometimes listed members. It could honour someone who had been killed or imprisoned. It could insult a rival. Crossing out another set's graffiti was more serious than damaging paint. It was a public challenge. A person walking past the wall might see only letters and numbers. Local teenagers could read the relationships inside them. They recognised which names had been crossed out, which letters had been altered, and which neighbourhoods were being threatened. The wall became a bulletin board for conflict. Schools brought these territorial identities together under one roof. Los Angeles school boundaries did not follow gang boundaries. Students from rival neighbourhoods could attend the same middle school or high school. They sat in the same classrooms, waited in the same lunch lines, and used the same entrances. The school day created opportunities for conflict that would not have occurred if everyone remained on their own block. A stare in a hallway could be interpreted as disrespect. A fight between two students could attract friends from both sides. The dispute could move from school grounds into the neighbourhoods after the final bell. Administrators often treated the first incident as a disciplinary problem between individuals. By the time adults understood the larger connection, relatives and older members might already be involved. Children learned these divisions before they fully understood them. An elementary school student could know that an older brother did not visit a certain park. A 12-year-old might recognise colours and neighbourhood names without belonging to any group. A student could inherit an enemy through a sibling. The divisions entered family life. A mother might have one son involved in a gang, and another trying to remain outside it. A cousin could belong to a rival set because he lived with a different parent in another neighbourhood. Family gatherings became complicated when neighbourhood loyalties were carried into the room. Romantic relationships also crossed boundaries. A girl living in one territory might attend school with a boy from another. Their relationship could lead to rumours, jealousy, or accusations that someone was providing information to rivals. The idea that gang warfare involved only gang members became less accurate as the network of relationships expanded. Friends gave rides, Sisters carried messages, girlfriends hid weapons, parents paid bail. Grandmothers allowed young people into homes because they had known them since childhood. Sometimes relatives supported the gang member. Sometimes they tried desperately to remove him from the life. Often they did both at different moments. A mother could condemn her son's actions while refusing to abandon him. The sets also developed internal age groups. Older members were sometimes called original gangsters or OGs, though the meaning and use of the term varied. Younger members adopted names that connected them to older figures. A respected member's nickname could be passed into a small chain of junior versions. This created a sense of lineage. A teenager was not simply joining the neighbourhood, he was entering a history. Older members told stories about past fights, dead friends, victories, and humiliations. The stories explained who the enemies were and why they could not be trusted. Much of this history was oral. There were no official records accepted by everyone. People remembered events differently. A confrontation described as an unprovoked attack by one side could be described as retaliation by the other. The younger members rarely received both versions. They received the story their set needed them to believe. That story could make revenge feel like an inherited responsibility. A teenager might be expected to hate someone he had never met because of a killing that occurred when he was a child. Death strengthened the identity. When a member was killed, his name could be written on walls, clothing, notebooks, or the bodies of friends. Funerals brought people together. Mourning could become recruitment. Younger relatives saw the attention given to the dead and absorbed the idea that membership guaranteed remembrance. It did not guarantee safety. Gang membership could increase the risk of assault, arrest, imprisonment, or death. The protection offered by the group often created new enemies. A young man joined because he feared being attacked alone, and then became a target because he had joined. The system reproduced itself through that contradiction. One neighbourhood armed itself because another neighbourhood was armed. The rival saw the new weapons and acquired more. One set attacked because it expected an attack. The other retaliated because failing to respond could be interpreted as weakness. No one needed to control the whole process. Each group made decisions that seemed defensive from its own position, while making the entire conflict more dangerous. The deaths of early leaders did not stop the expansion. Raymond Washington was killed in 1979. Stanley Williams was convicted in connection with 4 murders committed during robberies, and later sentenced to death. Whatever influence they once held could no longer provide even the possibility of coordination across the growing number of Crip sets. By that point, the identity had already moved beyond its founders. The name belonged to neighbourhoods that had never met Washington. Some members knew little about the earliest history. They did not need to know it. Their loyalty was to their own set. That local loyalty explains why Crip-on-Crip violence became possible. From the outside, 2 Crip sets appeared to be allies. From within the neighbourhoods, they could have a long history of shootings, fights, insults, and revenge. The larger identity mattered less than the immediate dispute. A person might be safe from one blood set because of a personal relationship, and in danger from another Crip set because of where he lived. The rules were never as simple as the colours suggested. Colours themselves also became more complicated over time. Blue became widely associated with Crips and red with Bloods, but clothing did not function as a perfect uniform. A person could wear a colour without being a member. Some sets adopted additional colours, sports clothing, hats, or symbols connected to their names. This uncertainty created the possibility of mistaken identity. A teenager wearing a blue jacket might be challenged by someone who assumed affiliation. A person visiting relatives could be questioned about where he was from. Giving the wrong answer, hesitating, or responding with anger could turn a short encounter into violence. The question, "Where are you from?" did not always mean someone wanted to know a city or hometown. In certain situations, it was a demand for affiliation. A safe answer depended on who was asking, where the encounter occurred, and whether the person being questioned was recognised. Someone who genuinely belonged nowhere could still be accused of lying. ordinary movement became risky for young black men in particular. Walking several blocks could involve crossing from one claimed territory into another. Bus routes carried passengers through multiple areas. A car breakdown could leave someone stranded in a location where strangers examined him closely. Most trips ended normally. Most interactions did not become shootings. The danger came from uncertainty. A person did not know which encounter would remain verbal and which would escalate. The growing number of sets made that uncertainty hard to manage. If Los Angeles had contained only 2 gangs, residents might have learned 2 territories and 2 chains of command. Instead, new names continued appearing. Groups divided when members argued, moved, or wanted their own status. A clique could separate from a larger set and establish an independent identity. Friendships changed. Alliances shifted. A neighbourhood that had been safe for someone one year might become dangerous the next because of a new dispute. No official map could keep up. Police departments attempted to collect intelligence on names, locations, members, alliances, and enemies. The information was often incomplete or outdated. Officers could misunderstand local relationships or treat everyone associated with a neighbourhood as part of the same structure. The sets understood themselves more precisely than the city did. They knew which blocks mattered, which people could negotiate, and which deaths remained unresolved. That knowledge gave them control over local life even when their total membership was small. By the late 1970s, the rivalry had become established enough to survive changes in leadership. Children grew up surrounded by names that had existed before they were born. Younger members entered sets whose enemies were already defined. The conflict no longer depended on the personalities of a few founders. It had become institutional memory without a formal institution. This is one reason attempts to end the violence were so difficult. A minister could bring representatives from several neighbourhoods into a church and ask them to agree to peace. The people in the room might be sincere. They could shake hands, speak honestly, and return home intending to stop the conflict. Then someone outside the meeting might fire a gun. A rumour could spread that the truce had been broken. No one could confirm who was responsible. Fear and anger moved faster than investigation. The agreement collapsed. The absence of central leadership meant that no one could promise every member would cooperate. It also meant that law enforcement could not dismantle the entire structure by arresting a small number of leaders. Removing one person created space for another. Arrests sometimes strengthened younger members who inherited status from imprisoned older associates. A teenager could build a reputation by committing violence while senior members were gone. Prison did not separate the street completely from the conflict. Letters, visits, family contacts, and returning prisoners carried information back and forth. Imprisonment could also deepen gang identity by placing members into a correctional environment where affiliation offered protection. The city's response increasingly focused on identifying members, documenting tattoos, photographing individuals, and creating intelligence files. These methods helped investigators connect suspects to crimes, but they also expanded police contact with young men who had not necessarily committed serious offences. A person could be entered into a gang database because of associates, clothing, location, or information from officers and informants. For residents who already distrusted the LAPD, the process confirmed a fear that the police viewed neighbourhoods as collections of suspects. The police saw a different danger. They saw groups multiplying, firearms appearing more often, witnesses refusing to cooperate, and retaliatory violence continuing after arrests. Officers responding to a shooting could not easily determine who was a victim, witness, suspect, or future retaliator. Both sides entered encounters expecting the worst. The gang member expected disrespect or arrest. The officer expected resistance or a concealed weapon. A resident standing nearby expected that neither side would care what happened to him. This tension existed before crack cocaine altered the street economy. That timing matters because it prevents us from treating drug money as the origin of every problem. The Crip and Blood identities had already divided into many sets. Territory already mattered. Retaliation already carried social pressure. Police community distrust was already deep. Young people were already learning that violence could create reputation. Crack would later increase the available money and make certain locations more valuable. Firearms would make retaliation faster and more lethal. Cars would allow attackers to enter and leave rival territory within seconds. Those developments intensified a structure that already existed. The structure had no single headquarters. No person could speak for every crip. No person could speak for every blood. Even respected figures usually controlled influence only within a particular neighborhood or network. The umbrella identities created an appearance of order, while the local sets operated through independence. This independence protected them from collapse. It also prevented peace. By the early 1980s, law enforcement agencies were describing the Crips and Bloods as collections of factions, rather than unified organizations. Some sets cooperated for profit, and others fought members who supposedly belonged to the same side. Later, federal assessments continued to note that most Crip and Blood groups remained local and maintained few or no meaningful ties to other sets using the same identity. The names had spread farther than the relationships. Inside South Central, residents did not experience this as an organizational theory. They experienced it through practical decisions. Which street should a child take home? Whose party was safe to attend? Could a cousin visit without being recognized by rivals? Was the graffiti on the garage only writing, or did it signal that a conflict was moving closer? Parents tried to answer these questions with limited information. The boundaries changed too quickly. Young people understood them better because they spent more time outside, at schools, parks, bus stops and shopping areas. Adults sometimes learned about a new rivalry only after a shooting. The neighborhoods were not yet living through the worst period. Many evenings remained peaceful. Children played outside. Families held birthday parties. Churches filled on Sundays. Local football games and school dances continued. The danger existed beside ordinary life rather than replacing it completely. That made the transformation easier for the rest of Los Angeles to ignore. A person driving through South Central might see small houses, traffic, businesses, and people waiting for buses. The territorial divisions were invisible unless someone knew how to read them. The signs were present on walls and in conversations, but they did not resemble a military occupation. Then guns became more common. A rivalry once expressed through fistfights could end with a death. The death required an answer. The answer produced another funeral. Each funeral gave younger members a new name to remember. Cars changed the distance from which violence could be delivered. An attacker no longer needed to remain in rival territory long enough to fight. He could approach, fire, and leave before anyone responded. The hundreds of sets created hundreds of potential lines of conflict. South Central had moved beyond the period when one growing gang threatened smaller neighborhood groups. The response to that expansion had produced a rival alliance, and both identities had fragmented into local organizations that could survive without their founders. The next stage would turn those neighborhood boundaries into front lines. Residents would begin measuring safety through intersections, clothing, parked cars, and the direction from which an engine approached. The geography of the city would remain unchanged on official maps, but the people living there would learn another map, one divided by reputation, memory, and the possibility of gunfire. By the early 1980s, the streets of South Central Los Angeles carried two different maps. One was the official map used by the city. It showed avenues, schools, parks, churches, housing developments, bus routes, commercial districts, and police boundaries. On that map, a road existed to move people from one place to another. A park was public space. A school served children assigned to its attendance area. An intersection was simply the point where two streets crossed. The second map existed in the minds of the people who lived there. It divided the same streets into territories claimed by different gangs. The borders were rarely announced with signs. They could run along a major avenue, behind a row of houses, through a park, or across one side of a housing development. Sometimes a boundary was understood clearly by everyone involved. In other places, rival groups claimed overlapping areas, making the border more dangerous because no one agreed on exactly where it was. For most adults, these divisions were an unwanted burden. For young people, learning them could become a matter of personal safety. A teenager might know that he could walk north for 4 blocks, but should not continue beyond a particular store. He might take a longer route home to avoid a park associated with another set. He could understand that a certain bus stop was safe in the morning but more dangerous after school, when groups of students gathered there. This knowledge was not taught in a classroom. It came through older brothers, cousins, friends, warnings from parents, and stories about people who had ignored the rules. The most dangerous feature of the map was that it did not distinguish neatly between gang members and everyone else. A person could become associated with a territory simply by living there. A young man standing outside his own apartment building might be assumed to belong to the gang that claimed the block. Someone wearing a jacket linked to a sports team could be mistaken for a rival because of its colour, lettering, or city name. A visitor who answered a question nervously could be treated as suspicious. The question, "Where are you from?" became one of the most serious questions a stranger could ask. In another setting, the answer might be Los Angeles, California, or the name of a neighbourhood. On certain streets, it was a demand to identify a gang affiliation. The person asking was not always interested in conversation. He was trying to decide whether the other person belonged, whether he was an enemy, or whether he could be intimidated without consequence. There was no completely safe response. Claiming a set could lead to an attack if the questioner was a rival. Denying membership could be interpreted as fear or dishonesty. Naming the neighbourhood where someone lived might be enough to produce a confrontation, even if he had never joined a gang. A brief exchange could move quickly. A challenge was issued. Someone responded. A friend stepped closer. Voices rose. One person reached toward a waistband. The presence of a gun changed every decision that followed. Earlier street conflicts had often involved fists, clubs, chains, knives, and other weapons used at close range. Those fights could cause severe injury and death, but the participants usually had to approach one another. A firearm allowed someone to kill from across a street, through a car window, or from the far end of a yard. It also allowed fear to become lethal. A young man who believed a rival was reaching for a weapon might fire first. A person who would have walked away from a fistfight could remain in a confrontation because he was armed. Someone who had been humiliated earlier could return with a gun and several friends. The weapon shortened the distance between anger and death. Research comparing gang and non-gang violence in Los Angeles during the late 1970s and early 1980s found that gang incidents were more likely to take place in public, involve younger participants, include cars and guns, produce multiple victims, and leave investigators dealing with unknown suspects and witnesses who feared retaliation. Those patterns explain why an ordinary street became such an important setting. A house could offer some protection, though not complete protection. A public sidewalk provided no controlled entrance and no reliable escape. A person standing near a driveway could be seen from a moving car. A group gathered outside a store could be approached from several directions. Young men often spent time outside because there were few private places available to them. Many lived in small, crowded homes shared with parents, siblings, cousins, or grandparents. Parks, sidewalks, school grounds, parking lots, and street corners became social spaces. Friends met there because meeting there cost nothing. The same visibility that made those places useful also made them dangerous. A rival did not need to search through a building. He could drive past the known gathering place and find several people standing together. He might recognize one target, believe he recognized one, or decide that everyone present represented the enemy neighborhood. The car made this type of attack easier. Los Angeles had been built around driving. Long straight roads connected residential areas to major avenues and freeways. A person could enter a neighborhood, attack from a vehicle, and leave within seconds. The driver did not have to stop. The shooter did not have to step onto the street. This reduced the personal risk to the attackers while increasing the danger to everyone nearby. A gun fired during a face-to-face confrontation was usually directed at a person standing close to the shooter. A gun fired from a moving vehicle was less precise. The car could be bouncing. The shooter might be frightened or inexperienced. Darkness, speed, parked vehicles and distance made accurate fire difficult. Several rounds could strike a wall, window, neighbouring house, or uninvolved person. The phrase drive-by shooting eventually became familiar across the United States, but familiarity made it sound more organised than it often was. Some attacks were planned carefully. People selected a target, obtained a car, concealed identifying features, and chose a route of escape. Others were impulsive. A group saw someone believed to be a rival and turned the car around. A passenger produced a weapon. The driver slowed. A few seconds later, shots were fired, and a conflict that might have ended with insults produced a funeral. Cars also created problems of identification. Witnesses often saw only a colour, body type, or partial license plate. The vehicle could be stolen. The shooter might be seated behind tinted glass. At night, a dark sedan could resemble hundreds of others in Los Angeles. By the time police arrived, the attackers were gone. The sound of the car became part of neighbourhood awareness. Residents noticed vehicles that passed more than once. They watched cars moving unusually slowly. A driver who stopped in front of a house without turning off the engine attracted attention. Young people standing outside learned to look toward a passenger window as a car approached. Most of the time, nothing happened. That did not make the fear irrational. It made the routine exhausting. A mother could spend an evening calling a son inside whenever an unfamiliar vehicle entered the block. A person walking home could step behind a parked car when an engine slowed. Families developed habits that would seem excessive in a safer neighbourhood but were reasonable under the circumstances. Some stopped sitting on front porches. Others avoided sleeping in front bedrooms. Beds were moved away from windows. Children were told to lie on the floor if gunshots sounded nearby. During periods of repeated shootings, families sometimes placed mattresses in hallways or bathrooms because interior walls offered more protection from bullets fired from the street. The house remained a home, but it was being adjusted for defence. Metal bars appeared on windows. Fences became taller. Exterior lights stayed on through the night. Dogs were kept in yards. Curtains remained closed even during warm weather. These changes could make residents feel safer, but they also changed the character of the street. A front porch once allowed neighbours to watch children and speak to people passing by. A high fence and barred window reduced that contact. People became less visible to one another while becoming more suspicious of strangers. The gang boundary did not have to stop people physically. Fear could do the work. A recreation centre located near rival territories might serve fewer children from one side because parents did not want them crossing the line. A family could avoid a grocery store with better prices because it stood in an area associated with another set. A teenager might reject a part-time job if the bus route required waiting at a dangerous intersection. Territorial violence therefore affected education, work, shopping, recreation, and family relationships even when no shooting occurred. Schools became some of the most difficult places to manage because they brought students from several neighbourhoods into the same enclosed space. A school could be neutral in official policy and deeply divided in practice. Students entered through the same gates but separated into groups during lunch. Certain benches, hallways, or sections of the yard became associated with particular neighbourhoods. Graffiti appeared on bathroom walls, desks, notebooks, and fences. Teachers might understand that a conflict existed without knowing its history. A student could refuse to sit in an assigned seat because it placed him near someone from a rival area. From the teacher's perspective, he was being disruptive. From the student's perspective, the seating arrangement exposed him to humiliation or attack. School officials faced an almost impossible task: Ignoring gang identity allowed intimidation to continue. Responding too aggressively could treat uninvolved students as gang members. Suspending young people removed them from school and returned them to the streets during the day, where gang influence could become stronger. The trip to and from school was often more dangerous than the classroom. Students gathered at bus stops and walked in groups. Rivalries that could not be acted upon inside the school because of teachers, security staff and administrators could resume after the final bell. A fight might begin on campus and end several blocks away. Older gang members sometimes waited outside schools to support younger relatives or associates. This turned a dispute between 14-year-olds into a confrontation involving people in their late teens or 20s. The age of the participants mattered because each generation introduced another group into an existing history. A child entering middle school might already know the set associated with his street. He might have watched older boys gather outside since he was in elementary school. Their clothing, nicknames, and reputation were familiar. They did not appear to him as strangers arriving to recruit. They were people from the neighbourhood. An older member might offer protection, money, a ride, or a sense of recognition. He could also apply pressure. The younger boy might be asked to carry something, deliver a message, watch for police, or prove that he was willing to fight. Small tasks created commitment. Once a young person had participated in an attack or been seen with members, leaving became harder. Rivals might already identify him as part of the gang. Police might record him as an associate. The set might view an attempt to withdraw as disloyalty. The territory followed him, even when he wanted to leave it. Girls and young women were also drawn into these conflicts, though their experiences were often ignored in public discussions that focused on armed young men. Some girls became members of female sets or cliques. Others were relatives, girlfriends, friends, or classmates of members. They carried information across neighbourhoods, gave rides, hid people inside homes, transported weapons, or participated directly in assaults. They could also become targets. A girlfriend might be attacked because of the person she dated. A sister could be threatened to punish a brother. A young woman standing with a group might be struck by bullets intended for someone else. The assumption that women and children would always be spared was never dependable. Territorial warfare depended on recognition, and recognition was often imperfect. A shooter might know only that a group stood inside rival territory. He might not know each person. Someone could be targeted because he resembled another man, drove a similar car, or wore clothing associated with a set. Misidentification added new disputes to old ones. The family of an innocent victim did not experience the death as a mistake that ended the matter. Relatives demanded answers. Friends wanted retaliation. Rumours identified possible attackers before detectives had evidence. A false rumour could produce a real shooting. This made investigation difficult from the beginning. Police arrived after the attackers had left. Witnesses feared being labelled informants. Some distrusted detectives. Others believed cooperation would bring retaliation against their homes or families. The phrase, "no one saw anything," could describe several different situations. Some witnesses genuinely saw very little. The attack lasted seconds. Darkness and confusion made details uncertain. Some saw the car but not the faces. Some recognised the attackers and refused to speak. Others gave information privately but would not testify in court. Without witnesses, detectives depended on physical evidence, informants, patterns of retaliation, and knowledge of local rivalries. A shooting in one territory might be connected to an assault days earlier in another. Investigators had to determine whether the victim had been targeted personally, mistaken for someone else, or attacked simply because of his location. Even the definition of a gang-related homicide was disputed. One agency might count any killing involving a gang member. Another might count only killings motivated by gang rivalry or activity. The difference could produce very different totals from the same set of deaths. Researchers examining South Central homicides later showed that narrow and broad definitions changed the number of incidents officially labelled gang-related. For residents, the label mattered less than the result. Someone was dead. A family was grieving. Another attack might follow. Funerals became dangerous gatherings because they brought many members of a set into one place. Police sometimes attended or watched from nearby, expecting possible retaliation. Families had to mourn while worrying that enemies might appear. Memorials formed on sidewalks and walls. Candles, photographs, handwritten messages, flowers, bottles, and clothing marked the location where someone had died. Graffiti preserved the person's nickname. Friends gathered there to talk and remember. The memorial could comfort the neighbourhood, but it could also extend the conflict. A rival might damage it. Someone could cross out the dead person's name. That act was interpreted as an insult not only to the victim, but to the entire set. Paint on a wall could lead to blood on a street. Graffiti was one of the clearest ways territory became visible. A set name written on a building announced presence. Additional markings identified members, allies, and enemies. Letters associated with rivals might be crossed out or written upside down. Threats could be communicated in ways that outsiders did not understand. The most hostile graffiti often appeared near territorial boundaries, where groups were competing for visibility. Research mapping black gang territories in Los Angeles found that the number of identified territories grew from 18 in 1972 to 274 by 1996, eventually covering more than 62 square miles. The same research found that hostile graffiti concentrated along boundaries, though gang homicides did not always occur, most frequently at those exact edges. That finding shows why the idea of a simple front line is incomplete. A conventional battlefield has two sides facing one another along a recognizable border. Los Angeles gang violence was more scattered. An attack could occur deep inside a neighborhood, outside a school, at a party, near a store, or while a person visited relatives. The boundary created hostility, but movement carried that hostility everywhere. Parties were especially vulnerable. A house party could bring together students from different schools and neighborhoods. Music, alcohol, crowded rooms, jealousy, and existing gang disputes created conditions where a small argument could expand. Someone was asked where he was from. A shoulder was bumped. A person believed he had been disrespected. Friends gathered around. If no gun was present, the incident might end in a fist fight. If several people were armed, the entire gathering could become a shooting scene. Parents who allowed parties in their homes could lose control of the guest list as friends invited other friends. Unrecognized people arrived. Cars lined the street. Neighbors became nervous. Police might break up the gathering, but the dispersal could move angry groups into surrounding streets rather than ending the conflict. Nightclubs, skating rinks, parks, and sporting events presented similar problems. Public spaces were meant to gather people. Gang conflict turned gathering into risk. The city responded by increasing police attention in areas associated with gangs. Specialized units collected information, monitored known members, and attempted to interrupt retaliatory cycles. Officers stopped groups, searched cars, photographed tattoos, and questioned young men about their affiliations. Police argued that they were responding to a serious and growing threat. Residents often agreed that the threat was serious while objecting to how the response was carried out. A teenager who had never joined a gang could be stopped because he stood with someone known to police. An officer might interpret neighborhood clothing as evidence of membership. Young men learned that traveling in a group could attract police attention, while traveling alone could expose them to rival gangs. There was no easy choice. An aggressive police stop could also create an audience. Being ordered against a wall in front of neighbors was humiliating. If the person resisted verbally, officers might view the response as threatening. Friends watching nearby saw the encounter as another example of police disrespect. Each stop entered the neighborhood's memory in the same way gang attacks did. The police remembered weapons, assaults, and officers fired upon. Residents remembered raids, beatings, damaged property, and people arrested without charges. Both histories shaped the next encounter. By 1980, the LAPD estimated that Los Angeles had about 9,000 gang members and reported that street and motorcycle gangs were responsible for nearly 4,000 serious crimes. The department had assigned more than 100 officers full-time to a special gang program, showing that the issue had already become a major institutional concern before the worst violence of the late 1980s. The numbers would continue to grow. More sets meant more possible rivalries. More rivalries meant more opportunities for retaliation. As firearms became increasingly available, the number of participants required to create a deadly incident became very small. One driver and one shooter could attack an entire group. The response to drive-by shootings eventually changed the physical design of some streets. In 1990, the LAPD introduced Operation Cul-de-sac in an area experiencing severe gang violence. Traffic barriers were placed across 14 streets to prevent cars from moving easily through the neighbourhood. The idea was simple. If attackers depended on rapid vehicle access and escape, closing routes might reduce their opportunities. Evaluations found that drive-by shootings, murders, and other crimes fell in the target area while the barriers and accompanying program remained in operation. When budget cuts and policy changes weakened the effort, crime moved back toward earlier levels. The barriers revealed how completely the street had become part of the violence. A road designed for access had to be blocked for safety. Residents living behind the barriers experienced both benefit and inconvenience. Emergency vehicles, deliveries, and ordinary drivers had fewer routes. Yet some families preferred the obstruction because a car could no longer race through the block, fire shots, and disappear onto a major avenue. Concrete and metal were being used to interrupt a conflict that social institutions had failed to contain. By 1989, the LAPD reported 1,113 drive-by shooting incidents, involving 1,675 victims. The department also estimated that as many as half of gang violence victims had no meaningful involvement in gang activity. Those figures came from law enforcement and reflected its own definitions, but they show the scale the problem had reached by the end of the decade. Behind each total was a location that had been ordinary moments earlier. A driveway, a bus stop, a front yard, a sidewalk outside a market, a child's bedroom facing the street. The danger was not constant in the sense that guns were fired every minute. Entire days could pass quietly. Families continued working, attending school, shopping, visiting relatives, and gathering for church. The damage came from never knowing when the quiet would break. A basketball game at a park could proceed normally until an unfamiliar car arrived. A birthday party could remain peaceful until a rival was recognised. A student could complete the school day safely and be attacked during the walk home. This uncertainty altered behaviour more effectively than any written rule. People reduced the amount of time they spent outside. Businesses closed earlier. Parents restricted children's movement. Witnesses avoided windows after shots were fired. Residents who could afford to move sometimes left, taking income and community connections with them. Those who remained were often blamed for conditions they had not created. Outside observers asked why residents did not simply identify the shooters, remove gang members from their homes, or leave the neighbourhood. Each solution ignored the risks. Identifying a shooter could expose a witness to retaliation. Removing a son or nephew from a home could leave him homeless and more dependent on the gang. Moving required money, available housing, transportation, and employment somewhere else. Families made choices inside narrow limits. The streets had not become front lines because every resident accepted gang rule. They became front lines because a relatively small number of armed groups could impose consequences on the movement of everyone around them. The city's response relied heavily on enforcement, but enforcement did not erase the geography. Arrested members returned from jail or prison. Younger members replaced older ones. A gang name remained painted on walls after individuals disappeared. Territory outlived people. The longer the rivalries continued, the less anyone remembered about their original causes. A dispute over a fight, party, theft, or insult became a series of funerals. After several deaths, asking who started it no longer mattered to those seeking revenge. Each side possessed a list of reasons. The street preserved those reasons through names, stories, memorials, and scars. Then the economics of the conflict began changing. Crack cocaine entered Los Angeles during a period when territorial structures, armed rivalries, police distrust, and youth unemployment were already established. It did not invent the boundaries, but it gave some of them new financial value. A corner was no longer only a place associated with identity. It could become a market. A set that had fought to defend its name could now fight to defend income. Cash allowed weapons to be purchased more easily. Younger teenagers could earn more in a day selling drugs than some adults earned through legal work in a week. The streets were already divided. The next development would make control of those streets increasingly profitable, and the cost of losing them increasingly deadly. The first thing to understand about crack cocaine in Los Angeles is that it did not arrive in an empty neighborhood. It entered streets where gang identities were already established. Territorial disputes already existed. Firearms were already being used. And many families were already dealing with unemployment, weak public services, and distrust of the police. The Crips and Bloods had divided into numerous local sets before crack became a major street commodity. Young men had been killed over neighborhood rivalries before sellers began earning large sums from small pieces of cocaine. Crack changed the crisis because it added a fast-moving retail economy to a conflict that had previously depended mainly on identity, reputation, and revenge. A street corner could now be worth money every hour it remained under someone's control. An apartment could become a place where drugs were prepared, stored, sold, or consumed. A person with access to cocaine could hire others to watch for police, handle customers, carry cash, or defend a selling location. Teenagers who had been excluded from the legal job market could earn money without submitting an application, waiting for an interview, or travelling across the county. The work was illegal, dangerous, and unstable, but it was available. During the early 1980s, cocaine was not new to Los Angeles. Powder cocaine had circulated for years, especially among wealthier users who could afford it. The price limited the market. A person usually purchased it in quantities that were too expensive for many residents of poor neighborhoods. Crack changed the price and the method of sale. Powder cocaine could be processed into small smokable pieces and divided into inexpensive individual purchases. A customer no longer needed enough money for a large quantity. A small amount could be bought, smoked quickly, and replaced soon afterward. That produced repeated transactions. A seller did not depend on one customer making one large purchase. The same person might return several times in a day. A busy location could process a constant movement of buyers, each carrying a small amount of cash. The individual sale was cheap. The total volume could be highly profitable. This difference made crack suitable for street-level distribution. It could be sold from sidewalks, alleys, motel rooms, apartments, abandoned buildings, parking lots, or houses where customers arrived throughout the day and night. The market became visible. Neighbours saw unfamiliar cars stopping briefly. They watched people approach a doorway, remain inside for only a minute and leave. Children learned which buildings to avoid. Landlords discovered that one apartment could affect an entire property. A location where crack was sold did not operate like a legal shop. There were no contracts protecting the seller, no courts settling disputes, and no insurance covering stolen inventory. Money and drugs had to be defended through secrecy, relationships, intimidation, or violence. Someone who robbed a dealer could not be reported in the ordinary way. A seller could not call the police and explain that several $1,000s in drug proceeds had been stolen. He had to absorb the loss, recover the money himself, or allow others to believe that he could be robbed without consequence. Reputation became part of the business. A A dealer known to respond violently to theft might discourage future attacks. A dealer considered weak could attract them. The same logic that operated in territorial gang disputes now operated inside the drug market. This did not mean that every crack seller was a gang member. That point is important because the history is often told as though the Crips and Bloods immediately took control of crack distribution across South Central. Research using Los Angeles police and sheriff's records from 1983 through 1985 found a dramatic increase in crack sales and some increase in gang member involvement, but it did not find that gangs dominated the early market. Cocaine sales arrests rose sharply during those years, while regular drug dealers remained the principal participants. The available evidence also did not show a simple, consistent increase in violence, caused specifically by gang involvement in crack sales. The distinction matters because it changes the explanation. Crack was not introduced by a single gang command. There was no meeting where Crip and Blood leaders decided to transform the economy of Los Angeles. Independent dealers, small crews, gang members, relatives, and people with no previous gang affiliation entered the trade for different reasons. Some already had connections to powder cocaine suppliers. Others began at the lowest level, purchasing small quantities and reselling them one piece at a time. A person did not need to control an international smuggling route to become a street dealer. He needed a supplier, a place to sell, customers, and enough protection to keep operating. This low barrier to entry made the market spread rapidly. A teenager could begin by watching for police. He might stand at the end of a block and signal when a patrol car approached. For this, he received cash, or a small amount of drugs to sell. Later, he could handle customers. He learned how to hide inventory, where to run during a raid, whom to trust with money, and how to recognize undercover officers. He became part of the operation without ever being formally hired. The drug market offered a ladder. At the bottom were lookouts, runners, and street sellers. Above them were people controlling larger quantities, supplying several locations or managing houses where crack was prepared and sold. Higher still were dealers with access to powder cocaine and enough capital to purchase in bulk. The ladder looked attractive because the rewards were displayed publicly. A successful dealer could buy a car, jewellery, clothes, stereo equipment, and gifts for friends or relatives. In neighbourhoods where legal employment had declined, these purchases carried a powerful message. The legal economy asked young people to wait, finish school, gain experience, find transportation, submit applications, accept low wages, hope the position remains available. The crack economy promised immediate payment. That promise was often false in the long term. Dealers were arrested, robbed, injured, addicted, or killed. Cash disappeared quickly. Cars were seized. Families were left with legal bills and funeral expenses. A 14-year-old watching from the sidewalk did not always see the long term. He saw someone a few years older carrying more money than the adults in his household. For gang sets, the market offered both opportunity and internal tension. Some members sold drugs together. A neighbourhood identity could provide trusted associates, a ready supply of lookouts, and protection for a selling location. The set's reputation discouraged outsiders from entering the area. Other members sold independently. They belonged to the same gang but competed for customers. Personal arguments over money, missing inventory, or unpaid debts could become conflicts within the set. A shared name did not guarantee a shared business. The drug trade could strengthen a gang without unifying it. Money purchased weapons, cars, bail, legal representation, and support for members in prison. It allowed older dealers to recruit younger workers. It made some individuals more influential than traditional neighbourhood leaders because they controlled income. At the same time, it created jealousy. A young dealer who earned rapidly could challenge the authority of an older member who had built his reputation through fighting. A person with access to a strong supplier might no longer accept instructions from someone who had seniority but little money. The internal balance of power changed. The set was still organised around territory and loyalty. But money became another source of status. The territory itself also acquired a new meaning. Before crack, a gang might defend a block because it represented home, identity, and reputation. With an active drug market, the same block could produce hundreds or thousands of dollars. Losing control meant more than accepting humiliation. It could mean losing income. This created a stronger reason to watch who entered the area. An unfamiliar dealer was not merely trespassing, he was competing. A rival gang selling nearby could attract customers and reduce profits. Yet the relationship between territory and drug sales was never completely straightforward. Some dealers sold inside their own gang's neighborhood. Others traveled to places with better demand. Members of rival gangs sometimes cooperated when money was involved. A Crip-affiliated dealer and a Blood-affiliated dealer could remain enemies in public while participating in the same supply network. Profit could cross boundaries that reputation could not. Older gang members were often more willing to cooperate in business because they understood the financial advantage. Younger members, who were still proving loyalty through aggression, might continue attacking one another even when older dealers preferred stability. This created another contradiction. The drug economy benefited from calm streets. Customers avoided locations where gunfire was frequent. Police attention disrupted sales. Dead sellers could not repay suppliers. Gang reputation, however, often demanded retaliation. A dealer might want peace for business reasons and still support violence after a friend was killed because refusing to respond weakened his standing. The same person could be calculating about money and impulsive about respect. Weapons became central to both concerns. A crack dealer carried cash and inventory, making him a target for robbery. He could not safely assume that a customer was only a customer. The person approaching might intend to purchase drugs, steal them, or identify the location for a later attack. A firearm offered protection, but it also raised the stakes of every encounter. Two armed dealers arguing over a debt could kill one another. A lookout frightened by an unfamiliar car could fire before confirming who was inside. A robbery that might once have ended with a beating could produce several deaths. During the 1980s, semi-automatic pistols and other weapons became increasingly visible in street violence. Public discussion often focused on military-style firearms, but the wider transformation involved the growing presence of guns capable of firing multiple rounds quickly and being reloaded more easily than older revolvers. The exact weapon mattered less to residents than the number of shots. A dispute that once produced 1 or 2 rounds could now fill a street with gunfire. More rounds meant more opportunities to strike a target, a companion, someone inside a house, or a child standing farther down the block. Firepower encouraged further firepower. If one crew was believed to carry semi-automatic weapons, rivals felt pressure to obtain similar or more powerful guns. A person who feared being outgunned could purchase a weapon before anyone had directly threatened him. The arms race did not require formal planning. Each individual believed he was responding to danger. Together, those responses made the environment more dangerous. Cars remained important. Drug sellers used them to transport cocaine, money, and weapons. Buyers arrived in them. Robbers used them to approach and escape. Gang members used them in retaliatory shootings. A new or expensive car could signal success, but it could also attract police attention and make the owner easier for rivals to identify. Dealers sometimes used rental cars, borrowed cars, or stolen vehicles to reduce that risk. License plates were removed, covered, or replaced. Weapons and drugs could be hidden in compartments. The mobility of Los Angeles helped the market expand beyond one block. A supplier could deliver to several neighborhoods. Dealers could travel from South Central to suburban communities or smaller cities where competition was weaker and prices were higher. In later years, some Los Angeles gang members would establish drug connections far beyond California. Though the first phase of the crack market remained more decentralized than later popular accounts suggested, this expansion gave the Crip and Blood names national recognition. News reports described gang members moving drugs across state lines. Police departments in other cities began identifying local groups as Crips or Bloods. Some had genuine relationships with Los Angeles members. Others borrowed the names, colours and symbols without any direct connection. The reputation travelled faster than the organisation. Inside Los Angeles, families experienced the economic change at ground level. A parent might notice that a son suddenly had cash but no job. A younger child could receive new shoes from an older brother, while understanding not to ask where the money came from. Rent might be paid with drug proceeds during a month when legal wages were not enough. This created moral and practical conflicts. A mother could oppose the dealing and still depend on the money. She might threaten to remove her son from the home, then hesitate because sending him away could increase the danger. She could refuse cash and later discover that he had paid the electric bill directly. Drug money did not remain separate from the household. It purchased food, school clothes, furniture, and medical care. It also brought weapons, police searches, rival dealers, and frightened customers toward the same home. A family could benefit from the income and suffer from the activity at the same time. Crack addiction created another set of pressures. The drug's brief, intense effect encouraged repeated use. Some customers spent money needed for food, rent, utilities, or children. Personal property was sold. Theft increased inside families. Relatives attempted to hide cash and valuables. The impact was visible but uneven. Not every user became immediately addicted. Not every household was affected in the same way. Public descriptions often portrayed entire neighbourhoods as consumed by crack, which erased the majority of residents who did not use the drug and continued their ordinary lives. Most people in South Central still worked, attended school, raised children, went to church, and avoided drug activity. They simply had to do those things around an expanding market. A person might pass several sellers while walking to a bus stop. A child could learn to recognise discarded glass pipes. A resident calling the police about traffic near a suspected crack house had to consider whether the complaint would remain confidential. Closing one location did not always end the market. Police could raid a house, arrest sellers, and seize drugs. Customers then moved to another building or corner. New dealers replaced those arrested because demand remained. Enforcement disrupted supply without removing the economic conditions that drew people into selling. The law also changed. Federal and state governments increased penalties for cocaine offences during the 1980s. The federal system treated crack cocaine far more severely than an equivalent weight of powder cocaine. The distinction contributed to long prison sentences that fell heavily on black communities. Supporters argued that harsh penalties were necessary because crack was associated with addiction, violence, and neighbourhood disorder. Critics argued that the laws punished street-level defendants more severely than people dealing larger amounts of powder cocaine and deepened racial inequality in the criminal justice system. For families, the debate became personal. A son could disappear into prison for years. His children grew up without him. His mother spent money on calls, visits, and legal assistance. When he returned, a criminal record limited employment and housing. Prison interrupted individual lives without necessarily interrupting the market. Someone else took the vacant position. The growing enforcement effort also intensified police presence in neighbourhoods where trust was already weak. Officers conducted surveillance, street stops, raids, and large operations intended to seize drugs and weapons. Residents who wanted dealers removed sometimes welcomed these actions. The same residents could become angry when doors were damaged, children were frightened, innocent people were detained, or officers treated every person inside a building as a suspect. Again, they were forced to hold two positions at once. They wanted relief from drug markets. They did not want to be treated as an occupied population. The public conversation rarely allowed for that complexity. Television reports showed crack houses, armed young men, police raids, and grieving relatives. The images were real, but repeated without context, they suggested that South Central was defined entirely by crime. The economic history disappeared. Factory closures received less attention than drug arrests. Housing discrimination was harder to film than a police battering ram. A teenager selling crack on a corner became visible, while the employers who had left the region remained off camera. This did not excuse the seller. It explained why the corner had become competitive with the factory. The drug market provided what the formal economy had stopped providing to some young people: entry-level work, advancement, cash, recognition, and a sense that effort produced immediate results. It provided those things through a system that damaged the workers, customers, and neighbourhood surrounding it. That is what made the new economy so destructive. It was not imposed entirely from outside, and it was not created entirely from within. Cocaine moved through international and regional supply networks before reaching local dealers. Street sellers then operated in neighbourhoods shaped by decades of public policy and private discrimination. Responsibility existed at several levels. The person selling crack made a choice. The person firing a gun made a choice. Those choices occurred inside a market that rewarded risk, and a city that had allowed legal opportunities to shrink. By the middle of the decade, cocaine sales activity had risen dramatically, but the connection between drugs, gangs, and homicide remained more complicated than officials and journalists often claimed. Studies of Los Angeles killings from 1986 through 1988 found that gang-motivated homicides were less likely than other homicides to involve narcotics, while narcotics-motivated killings were less likely to involve gang members. Researchers did not find support for the idea that most gang homicides were simply battles over drug trafficking. Many people were still being killed over identity, retaliation, personal arguments, and neighbourhood history. Crack intensified the environment without replacing its older causes. The money paid for guns and cars. The market placed armed people in public locations. Robbery became more attractive because sellers carried cash. Addiction destabilized households. Police operations increased. Prisons filled. At the same time, a shooting could still begin because someone crossed out a name on a wall. This combination made the late 1980s especially dangerous. Old rivalries continued while new disputes over money developed. A gang member might have one enemy because of neighbourhood affiliation, another because of a drug debt, and a third because of a personal insult. Each conflict could produce its own retaliation. The number of reasons for violence multiplied. Consider a dealer operating near a busy street. He has a small group working for him. One person watches the corner, another holds part of the inventory so that the dealer does not lose everything during an arrest. A third collects money. The arrangement looks organised, but it depends on trust. If cash is missing, someone is blamed. If police arrive too quickly, someone may be accused of informing. If a supplier is not paid, threats follow. There are no written accounts everyone accepts. A misunderstanding can become a killing. The dealer is also watching for rivals. He may believe another group wants the location. Whether that belief is accurate does not matter if he begins preparing for an attack. He buys additional guns. The rival sees the weapons and prepares as well. Customers continue arriving between these armed groups because addiction does not wait for safety. Residents continue walking past because the street is the route to their homes. The market and the neighbourhood occupy the same space. That was the central problem. Crack dealing did not occur in a separate criminal district. It occurred beside schools, churches, apartment buildings, stores, and bus stops. The people most exposed were not always the people earning money. A seller could leave after a shift. The grandmother living beside the selling location remained there all night. She heard arguments, car doors, police helicopters, and gunfire. Her windows faced the street. Her grandchildren played nearby. If she complained publicly, the people she feared knew where she lived. The economic benefits were concentrated. The dangers were shared. As the decade moved forward, Los Angeles responded with more officers, specialized gang units, narcotics teams, raids, arrests, and increasingly large suppression operations. The approach treated the crisis primarily as a problem of offenders who needed to be identified and removed. every arrest could be justified by an individual crime. The larger result was a community experiencing pressure from both directions. Gang members defended territory and markets through intimidation. Police entered the same territory, expecting resistance. Ordinary residents stood between them. The next phase of the story cannot be understood only by counting drugs, guns, or arrests. It requires standing inside that position, where a family could fear the young men on the corner and the officers arriving to remove them. By the end of the 1980s, South Central residents were not simply trapped inside gang wars, they were living inside an increasingly aggressive war against gangs as well. By the late 1980s, many residents of South Central Los Angeles had learned to recognize two different kinds of danger. One could arrive in an unfamiliar car moving slowly along the street. The other could arrive in a line of police vehicles. The first danger came from gang members looking for rivals, defending a drug market, or responding to an earlier attack. The second came from officers entering the neighborhood to find those same people. Both could change an ordinary evening within seconds. Both could bring weapons, shouting, confusion, and the possibility that someone who had done nothing would be hurt. For families living there, it was not enough to say that gangs were dangerous and the police were there to help. Gang violence was real. Residents saw the bodies, attended the funerals, repaired bullet holes, and brought frightened children inside. They wanted armed groups removed from corners. They wanted crack houses closed. They wanted officers to respond when someone fired into a home. At the same time, many residents had experienced police stops, raids, and sweeps that treated entire blocks as collections of suspects. Young men who were not gang members could be ordered against walls, searched, handcuffed, photographed, or taken into custody while officers tried to identify them. Families could ask for protection and still fear the methods used to provide it. This was the position that outsiders often failed to understand. A resident did not have to choose one fear. She could fear the gang member outside her house and the officer who might mistake her son for him. The Los Angeles Police Department entered the late 1980s under enormous pressure to control a crisis that appeared to be growing faster than the department's existing methods could contain. Gang sets were multiplying, drive-by shootings were increasing, crack sales were visible in public places, witnesses often refused to cooperate, weapons were easier to obtain, and many attacks ended before patrol officers could arrive. Police leaders believed that ordinary patrol responses were not enough. If officers waited for crimes to be reported, the shootings would continue. The department wanted to identify gang members before an attack, remove weapons from the streets, close drug-selling locations, and make it difficult for groups to gather openly. This led to a wider use of specialized units and large suppression operations. The word suppression was important. It did not mean investigating one specific homicide after it occurred. It meant applying pressure to gang activity across a neighborhood. Officers could stop suspected members, search vehicles, serve warrants, seize weapons, make arrests for outstanding violations, and disperse groups from public places. From the department's perspective, visible enforcement could interrupt violence. A group planning retaliation might be separated before it acted. A gun could be found during a traffic stop. A wanted suspect could be arrested while standing with friends. Drug sales could be disrupted by placing officers on the block. The difficulty was deciding who counted as a gang member and how much evidence was needed before police intervention. Gang membership was not recorded through a formal application. Officers relied on tattoos, clothing, graffiti, known associates, statements from informants, previous arrests, neighborhood location, and information collected by gang units. Some of those indicators were useful. A person displaying a set tattoo and admitting membership presented little ambiguity. A suspect identified by several reliable sources could be documented with reasonable confidence. Other indicators were much less certain. A teenager might wear clothing associated with a gang because it was fashionable, or because a local sports team used the same colour. He might stand beside gang members because they were cousins, neighbours, or classmates. He might live in a territory claimed by a set without participating in it. Police officers working under pressure did not always have time to separate those possibilities. The result was that association could become evidence. Young men learned that standing with the wrong person could attract police attention. A ride in a friend's car could lead to a search. A photograph taken with neighbourhood acquaintances could later be interpreted as proof of membership. The gang map that endangered residents on the street also influenced how police viewed them. An officer entering a known territory expected to find gang members. The young men living there knew that expectation existed. Each side approached the other with assumptions already formed. An officer saw a group on a corner and considered the possibility of concealed weapons, drug sales, or an approaching retaliation. The group saw a patrol car and expected harassment, humiliation, or arrest. A routine contact could become hostile before anyone had spoken. The officer ordered everyone to place their hands where they could be seen. One young man responded slowly because he was angry at being stopped again. The officer interpreted the delay as resistance. Voices rose. People nearby gathered to watch. The presence of an audience increased the pressure. The officer did not want to lose control in front of a crowd. The young man did not want to appear weak in front of his friends. Each person's reputation now depended on what happened next. A physical struggle could begin over a movement that neither side had intended as an attack. This did not make gang violence and police conduct morally identical. Gang members had no legal authority to control streets, intimidate families, or shoot rivals. Police officers had a public responsibility to protect residents and enforce the law. The imbalance of authority was exactly why police behaviour mattered so much. An officer could detain, search, arrest, and use force with the support of the state. A resident who believed that authority had been abused often found it difficult to challenge the officer's account. Complaints could be filed, but many people doubted that anything would happen. Some feared that complaining would bring further attention. Others did not know the officer's name or badge number. An encounter at night could end before a frightened person understood what information to collect. The LAPD's public image made these complaints hard to resolve. The department had long presented itself as professional, disciplined, and effective. Many white residents across Los Angeles viewed it as a barrier against disorder. Officers believed they were being asked to confront dangerous conditions that city institutions had failed to prevent. People in South Central often saw a department that arrived with force after years of neglect. The difference between those views widened as gang violence increased. One of the largest and most controversial police responses became known as Operation Hammer. The operation developed during the leadership of Chief Darrell Gates, who had taken command of the LAPD in 1978. Gates believed aggressive enforcement was necessary against gangs and drug markets. Under his leadership, large numbers of officers were deployed into targeted neighborhoods for concentrated sweeps. The name itself communicated the strategy. A hammer did not investigate quietly. It struck. During these operations, officers stopped vehicles, searched suspected gang members, checked identification, served warrants, and made large numbers of arrests. Streets filled with patrol cars and police vans. Helicopters circled above. Temporary command areas processed people taken into custody. The scale could be extraordinary. Hundreds of officers might enter a limited area during one operation. Young men were ordered to sit or lie on pavement while police determined their identities and checked for warrants. Houses and apartments associated with suspected gang activity were searched. Police leaders pointed to weapons and drugs seized during the sweeps. They argued that an overwhelming presence prevented shootings and told gangs that the city would not surrender public space. Residents saw something more complicated. Some were relieved. A grandmother living beside an active drug location might welcome the arrival of officers. For one evening, sellers disappeared. Cars no longer stopped outside. People who had threatened neighbours were removed from the street. A store owner, intimidated by local gang members, could see the operation as the first serious response to repeated complaints. Other residents watched innocent relatives detained alongside suspected offenders. They saw officers stop young men in bulk, rather than because of specific conduct. They saw people forced to the ground in front of their homes. Some witnessed property damage during searches or heard disrespectful language from officers. An operation could remove dangerous individuals while convincing the surrounding community that police regarded everyone there as expendable. This tension weakened the cooperation investigators needed. After a shooting, detectives asked witnesses to provide names and descriptions. Residents considered what had happened during previous police encounters. A person who believed officers had mistreated his family was less likely to trust them with sensitive information. Police then interpreted the silence as evidence that the neighbourhood protected gangs. Residents interpreted police frustration as further proof that officers did not understand the danger of speaking. Both sides became more certain about the other. Witness fear was not imaginary. A person who identified a shooter might continue living a few houses from the shooter's relatives and friends. Trials could take months or years. The witness could be required to testify publicly. Word of cooperation could spread through the neighbourhood long before the case reached court. Gang members used intimidation because it worked. A warning did not have to be explicit. Someone might stand outside the witness's house. A family member could receive a message. Graffiti could appear nearby. A car could pass slowly several times. The witness understood. Police protection could not always remove an entire family from the neighbourhood. Relocation programs were limited, and leaving created financial problems. A parent might lose a job, children might change schools, and relatives who remained could still face retaliation. Silence became a survival decision. Detectives working homicide cases experienced the consequences directly. They arrived at scenes where dozens of people had been present, but no one admitted seeing the shooter. Physical evidence could show where shots were fired, but not who fired them. A witness might speak privately and refuse to sign a statement. Another might provide a false name for the suspect to redirect police attention. Rumours moved faster than verified information. Without cooperation, cases remained unsolved. Unsolved killings encouraged retaliation because victims' friends believed the police would not provide justice. They began searching for suspects themselves. That search was often inaccurate. A rumour identified a rival set. Someone recognised a car believed to have been involved. A young man was blamed because he had argued with the victim several days earlier. An attack followed before investigators established the truth. Police then faced another homicide with frightened witnesses. The cycle strengthened both gang violence and aggressive policing. Officers argued that residents would not cooperate, so proactive sweeps were necessary. Residents argued that aggressive policing destroyed trust, so cooperation was dangerous or pointless. No single incident created this relationship. It was built through repeated encounters. A family might call police after hearing gunfire and wait a long time for officers to arrive. On another day, the same family's teenage son might be stopped and searched while walking home. The parents asked why police could find their child so easily, but could not find the person shooting on the block. Officers gave an answer that made sense from their position. They needed evidence. They needed witnesses. They could not arrest someone based only on neighbourhood suspicion. The family gave an answer that made sense from theirs. They had given information before. Nothing changed. Speaking again might place them in danger. This was not a complete absence of cooperation. Community residents organised marches, meetings, neighbourhood watches, church programs, and anti-gang efforts. Parents worked with schools. Clergy attempted to mediate disputes. Local activists pressured city officials for services and safer streets. The LAPD also developed community-oriented programs. Its 1989 annual report described the Police Assistance Community Enhancement Program as the centre of departmental community-based policing efforts. The same report stated that gang-related active trafficker suppression teams had closed 461 rock houses, arrested nearly 4,200 gang members, and reduced identified gang hotspots from 210 to 136. Those figures reflected the department's own measurements, but they show how strongly its strategy combined community programs with large-scale enforcement. The two approaches did not always fit together comfortably. A community officer could spend months building trust with residents. A suppression operation involving officers from outside the area could damage that trust in one night. Residents might know one officer by name and still fear the department as an institution. The officer might sincerely want cooperation, but have little influence over how specialised units conducted raids or stops. Police departments often speak of the community as though it has one opinion. South Central did not. Some residents wanted even tougher enforcement. They were tired of dealers controlling entrances, gang members recruiting children, and gunfire interrupting sleep. They believed civil rights complaints received more attention than victims of gang violence. Others believed enforcement had already become excessive. Many occupied the space between those positions. They wanted specific violent people arrested, but they did not want hundreds of young men treated as interchangeable suspects. They wanted officers on dangerous streets, but they did not want unnecessary searches. They wanted police to use force when required, but they did not trust the department to admit when force was abused. This distinction was difficult to preserve during public debate. Criticism of the LAPD could be portrayed as support for criminals. Support for stronger policing could be portrayed as indifference to abuse. Families did not have the luxury of choosing a simple side. Their children were exposed to both systems. A boy might be pressured by a gang at school and stopped by police on his way home. Joining the gang could make him a target for officers. Refusing to join did not guarantee that officers would believe him. Parents developed instructions for both encounters. When gang members approach, do not insult them, do not stare, do not repeat rumours, leave if you can. When police approached, keep your hands visible. Do not reach into your pocket, answer clearly. Do not argue in the street. The advice had the same purpose: come home alive. The emotional burden of this routine was rarely included in crime statistics. A parent listening for a key in the front door did not know whether a late child had missed a bus, been stopped by police, been attacked, or chosen not to call. A siren several blocks away produced a list of possibilities. A helicopter searchlight moving over the roof interrupted sleep. The family waited for the telephone. Police helicopters became one of the most recognizable features of nighttime enforcement in Los Angeles. Their lights moved across houses and yards while loudspeakers ordered suspects to surrender or residents to remain inside. From the air, the neighborhood could be observed as a grid. On the ground, people experienced the helicopter as noise, light, and uncertainty. Children woke. Conversation stopped. Residents stepped away from windows. The aircraft might be searching for an armed person who posed a genuine danger. It still made every home beneath it part of the operation. Raids created a more direct form of disruption. Police targeting crack houses or suspected gang locations often entered quickly because delay allowed weapons or drugs to disappear. Officers expected barricaded doors, armed suspects, and attempts to destroy evidence. Residents expected doors to be broken and everyone inside to be treated as dangerous. Sometimes the intelligence was accurate. Officers found cocaine, cash, firearms, and wanted suspects. Sometimes people uninvolved in the activity were present. Children, girlfriends, elderly relatives, and tenants sharing the building could be handcuffed while officers secured the location. Even when the arrest was justified, the experience affected everyone inside. A child did not distinguish between an officer lawfully searching for drugs and an invading force. He remembered shouting, weapons, broken doors, and adults placed on the floor. The police saw operational necessity. The family remembered fear. Civil gang injunctions added another tool to the city's response. In 1987, Los Angeles obtained an injunction against members of the Playboy gangster Crips that prohibited conduct, including intimidating residents, blocking sidewalks and driveways, and committing graffiti. Violating the court order allowed police to arrest people for behaviour that might otherwise have produced a warning or a minor citation. Prosecutors described the gang as a public nuisance that could be addressed through civil law. The idea was attractive because ordinary criminal prosecution required proof of a specific offence. An injunction could restrict association and behaviour inside a defined area before a serious crime occurred. Supporters believed it returned sidewalks and public spaces to residents. Critics saw a system in which people identified as gang members could be prohibited from standing together, travelling in certain areas, or engaging in otherwise lawful conduct. The same identification problem returned. Who was a member? What happened when someone stopped participating but remained documented? Could a person be restricted because of old associations? These questions would continue long after the 1980s. For officers, the daily work remained dangerous. Gang members sometimes fired at police. Officers entered houses without knowing who was armed. Traffic stops could uncover weapons. A person fleeing might be wanted for a homicide or might simply fear arrest for a minor offence. The department's aggressive culture did not develop without exposure to real violence. That reality cannot be removed from the history. An officer who had seen a partner injured approached the next encounter differently. He watched hands, waistbands, windows, and doorways. A movement that looked harmless to a resident could appear threatening to someone trained to anticipate attack. The problem arose when constant anticipation turned every person into a potential enemy. A department can prepare officers for danger without teaching them that an entire community is hostile. In Los Angeles, many residents believed that line had been crossed. Language used by police leaders deepened the concern. Chief Gates became known for blunt statements and a confrontational public style. His supporters saw a leader willing to defend officers and confront violent criminals. His critics saw a chief who dismissed community complaints and encouraged a culture of domination. The department's internal discipline also faced growing scrutiny. Residents believed officers used excessive force and then protected one another. Supervisors were accused of failing to identify patterns of misconduct. Complaint systems did not convince the public that abusive officers would be removed. These concerns existed before the event that would expose them nationally. On March 3, 1991, California Highway Patrol officers pursued a car driven by Rodney King after he failed to stop. The chase ended in Los Angeles. Several LAPD officers surrounded King, and a nearby resident, George Holliday, recorded part of the encounter with a video camera. The footage showed officers striking King repeatedly with batons as other officers stood nearby. Millions of people eventually watched it. For viewers unfamiliar with complaints from Black and Latino communities, the recording appeared shocking and exceptional. For many residents of South Central, it appeared shocking but not unfamiliar. The camera had captured what they believed the city usually refused to see. This difference in reaction was important. The national audience asked how such a beating could happen. Residents asked why anyone was surprised. The city created the Independent Commission on the Los Angeles Police Department, commonly called the Christopher Commission after its chair, Warren Christopher. The commission examined use of force, internal discipline, recruitment, training, and the department's culture. The investigation concluded that a significant number of officers repeatedly used excessive force and that the department systems had failed to control them. It described serious problems involving supervision, complaint review, and a culture that tolerated unnecessary aggression. The findings did not mean every LAPD officer was abusive. They showed that misconduct could not be dismissed as a few unrelated incidents. For residents who had spent years describing the same problems, official recognition came late. The beating also complicated the struggle against gang violence. Police legitimacy is not separate from crime control. Detectives need witnesses. Patrol officers need residents to report weapons, identify suspects, and share information. When the public believes officers may abuse them without consequence, cooperation becomes harder. Gang members benefited from that distrust. They could tell younger people that the police were enemies of the neighbourhood. The King footage appeared to support the claim. A teenager who had experienced aggressive stops did not need much persuasion. This did not make the gang a safer institution. It made the police a less convincing alternative. During the same period, homicide continued rising. Families could not wait for the department to reform before seeking protection. They still called 911. They still wanted patrol cars nearby after shootings. The relationship became one of dependence without trust. Residents needed the police and feared them. Police needed residents and distrusted them. Gang members operated in the space between. They intimidated witnesses, recruited young people, and claimed that only the neighbourhood could protect itself. Police responded with larger operations, more documentation, and stronger enforcement. Each side pointed to the actions of the other as justification. The people with the least control experienced the greatest disruption. A child could lose an older brother to gang violence and a father to a long prison sentence. A family could have one relative working for the city and another documented as a gang member. A mother could cooperate with detectives in one case and file a complaint against officers in another. These were not contradictions to the people living them. They were the normal complexity of the neighbourhood. By 1991, the pressure was no longer limited to South Central. The Rodney King video had transformed police conduct in Los Angeles into a national issue. The officers involved would be prosecuted, and the case would move to a courthouse in Simi Valley, outside the city and away from the neighbourhoods where trust had already collapsed. At the same time, gang homicides, crack markets, unemployment, and territorial conflicts continued. The city was approaching a moment when several unresolved histories would meet. Residents were waiting for the courts to decide whether the violence shown on the videotape was criminal. Police officers were waiting to see whether the city would continue supporting them. Gang members were continuing their own conflicts regardless of the trial. Families were listening to gunshots and helicopters while watching legal proceedings that seemed to ask whether their experiences could be believed. Los Angeles had spent years using force to hold together neighbourhoods that had received too little investment and too little trust. The question was what would happen when that force was publicly challenged, and the system responsible for judging it failed to produce the result many residents expected. Los Angeles entered 1991 carrying more pressure than the city could comfortably explain. The streets were still crowded, freeways still filled before sunrise, film crews still blocked traffic, tourists still photographed the Hollywood sign, and airplanes still descended over neighbourhoods on their way into Los Angeles International Airport. From a distance, the city continued to function. Inside many homes in South Central, people were waiting for the next phone call. The call might come from a hospital, a police station, a frightened relative, or a neighbour who had heard that someone had been shot. Parents kept track of children by asking where they were going, who would be there, and how they planned to return. Teenagers learned to give exact answers because "I will be around" was not enough in a neighbourhood divided by gang territory. A few minutes could matter. Leaving school by one gate instead of another could change whom a student encountered. Missing a bus could leave someone waiting after the crowd had gone. A friend offering a ride might be helpful, or the car itself might be recognised by rivals. The city's homicide problem had reached a level that made violent death feel close even to families with no gang involvement. Killings were not distributed evenly across Los Angeles. Some sections of the city experienced comparatively little violence. In parts of South Central, residents heard about new deaths with exhausting regularity. The victim might be a gang member, a suspected dealer, a witness, a child, or a person who had simply been standing in the wrong place. The official categories did not always match the family's experience. Police could describe a homicide as gang-related because one person involved belonged to a set. Relatives might insist that the victim was not active, had stopped participating, or had only grown up with people who were. A young man could reject gang membership and remain identified by the neighborhood where he lived. The label followed the territory. By this point, violence had become part of how Los Angeles was discussed nationally. Television reports showed police helicopters, apartment raids, graffiti, crack sales, grieving mothers, handcuffed teenagers, and officers displaying seized weapons. These images were real, but they were incomplete. They rarely showed the hours between emergencies. They did not show parents preparing breakfast after a night of gunfire or children arriving at school after police had searched the apartment next door. They did not show the worker who left home before dawn because an early bus felt safer than walking after dark. The crisis became visible through its most dramatic moments, while remaining largely invisible as a daily routine. Residents adapted because there was no other practical choice. They memorised safe routes. They stopped at stores before evening. They avoided arguments with strangers. They kept children away from front windows when cars slowed outside. Some families changed sleeping arrangements during periods of repeated shootings. These decisions were not spoken about as bravery. They were household management. The larger city often responded to the same conditions through distance. People living outside South Central could watch the violence on the evening news and then turn off the television. The neighbourhoods appeared close enough to fear and far enough to avoid. This separation encouraged the belief that the crisis belonged only to the people living inside it. It did not. The factories that had closed were part of the regional economy. The housing patterns that concentrated poverty had been created through citywide and national policies. Police strategies were approved by public institutions, courts, prisons, schools, employers, landlords, banks, and transportation systems all influenced what happened on those streets. Still, when a teenager stood on a corner selling crack, he became the most visible part of a much larger system. Los Angeles was also entering a serious recession. Southern California suffered a particularly severe employment decline during the early 1990s. Total employment in the region fell by more than 7% between mid-1990 and mid-1993, a deeper contraction than the downturn experienced in Northern California. The losses were connected to reductions in defense and aerospace employment, weakness in construction and real estate, and broader economic decline. For communities already weakened by earlier industrial losses, the recession did not create a new problem so much as deepen an existing one. A person who had survived one plant closure might now face layoffs in another industry. Small businesses lost customers. Families doubled up in apartments. Young people looking for entry-level work competed with adults who had years of experience. Legal income became harder to obtain. At the same time, the illegal economy remained close and visible. The recession also affected city government. Public agencies faced pressure to reduce spending while demand for services increased. Schools, youth programs, housing assistance, policing, courts, and hospitals were all expected to manage more strain. Budget problems were discussed through numbers. Residents experienced them as closed programs, longer waits, fewer staff members, and another reason to believe that public institutions were disappearing when they were needed most. Gang violence continued through these economic changes. Sets did not suspend their rivalries because unemployment was rising. Drug markets did not close because families were struggling. Economic stress could increase conflict inside households, while leaving neighborhood conflict untouched. A young person returning from prison faced fewer job opportunities. A teenager trying to avoid dealing had fewer places willing to hire him. A family attempting to move away from a dangerous block encountered high rents, discrimination, and the cost of relocation. The alternatives narrowed. This was the condition of the city on the night of March 3rd, 1991, when California Highway Patrol officers attempted to stop a car driven by Rodney King. King did not stop immediately. A pursuit followed through the San Fernando Valley. When the car finally stopped, Los Angeles police officers joined the encounter. What happened next would normally have been known through police reports, witness testimony, and the accounts of the people directly involved. This time, there was a camera. George Holliday, a resident watching from a nearby apartment, recorded officers striking King repeatedly with batons while other officers stood at the scene. The recording did not capture every moment of the encounter, but it captured enough to transform a local use of force case into a national event. Television stations played the footage repeatedly. Viewers watched King on the ground. They watched officers swing their batons. They watched the beating continue. For people who had trusted the LAPD, the video demanded an explanation. For many black residents, it appeared to confirm years of complaints. The difference between those reactions shaped everything that followed. People outside heavily policed neighbourhoods often treated the recording as a shocking exception. Residents who had experienced aggressive stops, raids, chokeholds, beatings, and disrespect believed the difference was not the conduct. The difference was that someone had filmed it. The event produced immediate public anger and placed Chief Darrell Gates under growing pressure. An independent commission led by Warren Christopher examined the department's use of force, discipline, supervision, and internal culture. The commission was created to investigate elements of the LAPD that might cause or contribute to excessive force, and later civil rights reviews described the King beating as evidence of the widening divide between law enforcement and minority communities in Los Angeles. The commission found problems that could not be explained by one night or a few isolated officers. Its work identified repeated excessive force complaints involving a minority of officers and weaknesses in supervision and discipline. It also examined the department's culture and the difficulty of holding officers accountable when colleagues and supervisors accepted or failed to report misconduct. These findings gave official form to concerns residents had expressed for years. The report did not remove the officers from the streets immediately, rebuild trust, or settle the criminal case. It confirmed that the problem was serious while leaving the city to wait for the courts. 4 officers were prosecuted in state court. The legal process moved slowly enough for expectations to build. People watched pre-trial hearings and listened to lawyers argue about what the video showed. The defense maintained that individual baton strikes and users of force had to be evaluated through police training, and the behavior officers believed they were confronting. The prosecution argued that the officers had gone beyond lawful force. The same recording could be slowed, paused, divided into individual movements, and explained in different ways. To many viewers, this felt unnecessary. They believed their own eyes had already answered the question. Courtrooms do not operate through public certainty. Prosecutors had to prove specific charges under legal standards. Defense attorneys had to create reasonable doubt. Jurors were instructed to consider evidence and law rather than the public meaning of the case. This distinction was correct as a matter of legal procedure. It did not reduce the political weight placed on the verdict. The trial was moved from Los Angeles to Simi Valley in Ventura County. The change of venue became controversial because Simi Valley was a predominantly white suburban community, geographically and socially removed from the neighborhoods where anger toward the LAPD was strongest. Legal commentators later argued that the location and jury pool raised serious questions about fairness, even though the move had been justified by concern that intense publicity in Los Angeles could prevent an impartial trial. For South Central residents, the distance had symbolic importance. The case had begun with an LAPD beating recorded in Los Angeles. The people deciding the officer's guilt would sit outside Los Angeles County. The communities most affected by the department's conduct would not be represented in the way many residents expected. While the trial approached, daily violence did not pause. A gang member did not postpone retaliation because the city was debating police reform. A crack seller did not close his location while lawyers examined the videotape. Officers continued patrolling streets where some residents now viewed every use of force through the image of Rodney King. Police work became more politically exposed without becoming less dangerous. Officers knew cameras might be present. They also knew firearms remained common and that gang conflicts could erupt without warning. Some believed the entire department was being condemned for the actions shown on the recording. Residents heard that defensiveness and believed the department still did not understand the problem. Each side felt unfairly judged. The city continued holding meetings, releasing reports, and discussing reform, but the emotional argument had moved beyond policy. For many black residents, the King case asked whether violence committed by police would be treated as real violence. For many officers and supporters of the LAPD, the case asked whether jurors would be allowed to evaluate police conduct without surrendering to public pressure. Those questions did not lead toward the same expectation. The approaching verdict therefore carried more weight than the guilt or innocence of 4 defendants. People treated it as a judgment on the credibility of an entire community. If the officers were convicted, residents hoped the decision would establish that the badge did not place someone beyond accountability. If they were acquitted, many believed the legal system would be announcing that recorded evidence was still not enough. City officials knew the verdict could produce a strong reaction. The LAPD also had experience with civil disorder. The Watts Uprising of 1965 remained part of the city's institutional memory. The King video had been broadcast nationally. Community anger was public and sustained. Despite those warnings, the official investigation conducted after the 1992 unrest found a general lack of emergency preparedness in the city and the LAPD, including inadequate preparation specifically for the period before the Simi Valley verdict. That failure did not mean no one expected trouble. It meant expectation had not been converted into an effective plan. Police leaders had to consider several possibilities. A conviction could lead to celebration or demonstrations. A mixed verdict could produce confusion. An acquittal could trigger protests. But officials did not know where they would begin, how large they would become, or whether they would remain peaceful. Preparing too visibly could appear provocative. Rows of officers in riot gear might communicate that the city expected black residents to become violent. Preparing too little risked leaving neighborhoods unprotected. The decision required careful leadership. Los Angeles did not provide enough of it. The uncertainty reached individual officers. Some were assigned to monitor possible demonstrations. Others continued normal duties. Commanders did not always receive clear instructions about deployment, or how rapidly units could be moved if crowds formed in several locations. The city possessed a large police department, but size did not guarantee coordination. At street level, residents sensed the tension without knowing the operational details. Church leaders discussed how to respond. Community organizations planned vigils and public gatherings. Activists prepared for the verdict. Store owners considered whether to close early. Parents told teenagers not to attend protests because they feared police confrontation, gang involvement, or both. Other parents believed young people had a right to express anger. The same household could contain both views. The case also unfolded against continuing conflict between Korean American merchants and black customers in South Central. Many Korean immigrants had entered businesses in neighborhoods where larger chains and earlier owners had withdrawn. They often worked long hours in small grocery stores, liquor stores, and other shops. Language differences, cultural misunderstandings, economic resentment, and the physical separation between owners and customers produced tense relationships. Merchants feared robbery and violence. Customers sometimes felt watched, disrespected, or treated as potential thieves. The store counter became another place where different forms of insecurity met. One event gave this tension a permanent name. On March 16th, 1991, 13 days after the Rodney King beating, 15-year-old Latasha Harlins entered Empire Liquor Market in South Central. Store owner Sunja Do accused her of attempting to steal a bottle of orange juice. A physical confrontation occurred. As Harlins turned to leave, Do shot her in the back of the head. Security camera footage recorded the killing. Do was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, but the judge sentenced her to probation, community service, and a fine rather than prison. For many black residents, the sentence became another example of a legal system placing little value on black life. The King video showed police officers beating a black motorist. The Harlins video showed a store owner shooting a black teenager. In both cases, the public could see what happened. The legal outcomes would be judged through different charges, facts and procedures, but people did not experience them as unrelated cases. They became part of the same growing belief that visible harm could still produce limited accountability. This was the emotional climate of 1991. The city was not waiting for one verdict alone. It was carrying the King beating, the Harlins killing, years of gang deaths, police sweeps, unemployment, drug markets, housing inequality, and a long history of official promises that had not transformed daily life. Any one of these problems might have been managed separately. Together, they created pressure without a reliable release. The police department faced demands for reform while continuing aggressive gang suppression. Gang members continued killing one another while some local leaders attempted peace discussions. Residents wanted protection but did not believe the institutions offering it could be trusted. Businesses installed stronger barriers. Families installed stronger locks. The city installed more expectations on a court case. As 1992 began, the state trial of the 4 officers moved toward its conclusion. The videotape was shown again. Lawyers explained movements, commands, strikes, and police procedures. Jurors listened outside the city where the beating had occurred. Los Angeles waited. Waiting did not mean the streets became silent. Police records from the first months of 1992 continued to show substantial homicide, robbery, and aggravated assault levels across the city, with especially heavy violence in divisions serving central and southern neighborhoods. Each new killing added grief, while public attention remained fixed on the trial. People living outside the affected neighborhoods could treat the King verdict as the main question facing Los Angeles. Residents inside them still had to survive the evening before the verdict arrived. They heard that gangs might use demonstrations as cover for crime. They heard that police were preparing for unrest. They heard rumours about when the jury would return. Most rumours were unreliable. The uncertainty was not. Community leaders urged calm. Some explained that an acquittal would be painful, but should be answered through lawful protest. Others warned officials that public anger could not be controlled through speeches after years of neglect. Gang members listened to the same news as everyone else. Their relationship to the coming unrest was not simple. Some cared deeply about the King case. Some saw the police as a common enemy across gang boundaries. Others were more focused on local rivals and drug business. Several Crip and Blood figures had already begun discussing truces in parts of South Los Angeles. These efforts grew from exhaustion with killings and from a belief that continued neighborhood warfare benefited neither side. The King beating added another argument. Young black men who had spent years fighting one another were watching the police use violence against someone who was not part of their rivalry. The idea of a larger shared grievance did not erase every territorial feud. It created a possibility that had previously seemed unlikely. The city government paid limited attention to that possibility before the unrest. Gang members were still viewed primarily as targets for suppression. Residents who knew the local relationships understood that even a temporary reduction in retaliation could save lives. Los Angeles therefore approached April 1992 through several kinds of waiting. Families waited to see whether a child would return safely. Gang members waited to see whether rivals would honour informal agreements. Officers waited for instructions. Activists waited for the jury. Store owners waited to decide whether to close. The city waited for a legal decision while failing to settle the conditions that made the decision so dangerous. On April 29th, the jury announced its verdicts. The officers were acquitted on most charges. One charge against Officer Lawrence Powell did not produce a verdict and ended with a hung jury. The announcement travelled through television, radio, workplaces, stores, schools, police stations and homes. People watched the words appear on screens. Not guilty, not guilty, not guilty? For residents who had believed the videotape made acquittal impossible, the result did not feel like a technical legal judgment. It felt like rejection. The city had been holding its breath for months. Within hours, people would begin gathering at intersections, traffic would stop, arguments would become confrontations. The police response would break down at several critical locations, and violence would spread faster than officials could control it. But during the first moments after the verdict, before the fires and emergency broadcasts, Los Angeles was still a city listening to the same announcement. Millions of people heard it. They did not hear the same meaning. The first fires appeared before much of Los Angeles understood that the police had lost control. On the afternoon of April 29th, 1992, people began gathering near the intersection of Florence and Normandy in South Central. News of the verdict had moved quickly through homes, stores, schools, workplaces, and car radios. 4 Los Angeles police officers had been acquitted on nearly every state charge connected to the recorded beating of Rodney King. For many residents, the decision confirmed a belief formed over years of police stops, raids, complaints, and unanswered accusations. They had watched the recording. They had seen the batons rise and fall. Now they had heard that the law did not consider what they saw sufficient for conviction. Anger did not immediately produce one coordinated uprising. There was no central organisation assigning targets or directing crowds. Small groups gathered for different reasons. Some came to protest, some came to watch, some were already prepared to damage property or steal. Others arrived after seeing smoke or hearing that the police had withdrawn. The situation changed rapidly because public authority became uncertain. Drivers were pulled from vehicles, windows were broken, stores were entered, objects were thrown at passing cars. Television helicopters recorded attacks from above, while police units remained away from several critical intersections. One of the most widely remembered victims was Reginald Denny, a white truck driver who was pulled from his vehicle and beaten at Florence and Normandy. Several local black residents later entered the intersection, protected him, and drove him to a hospital. That rescue mattered because it showed what the most repeated images often fail to show. The crowd was not one person. The neighbourhood was not one mind. Some people attacked strangers, some stole, some started fires. Others tried to stop the violence, treated the injured, directed traffic, protected businesses, or brought people away from danger. The same street could contain cruelty and assistance within minutes. As the evening continued, the unrest spread beyond the first intersection. Looting and arson moved through commercial corridors. Fires consumed businesses that had served local residents for years. Firefighters attempting to reach burning buildings faced blocked roads, large crowds, and reports of gunfire. The LAPD response was disorganized. Officers had not been deployed in sufficient numbers at important locations before the verdict. Command decisions were delayed. Units received conflicting instructions. Some police withdrew rather than engage crowds without adequate support. The independent review conducted afterward concluded that Los Angeles and its police department had shown a broad lack of emergency preparation before the verdict, and serious failures of command once the unrest began. For residents calling for assistance, the distinction between strategic withdrawal and abandonment meant very little. The telephone rang. No one came. A shop owner saw people gathering outside and waited for police cars that did not arrive. A family watched smoke move closer to its block. A person injured in the street depended on neighbours because emergency vehicles could not reach the area safely. The city that had sent large police operations into South Central to conduct gang sweeps now appeared unable to protect the same streets during a public emergency. That contradiction was not lost on residents. People remembered officers arriving in force to stop young men, search cars, and raid suspected drug houses. When buildings burned and frightened residents asked for protection, those forces seemed to disappear. The uprising moved west, north, and east. It reached areas outside the neighbourhoods most closely associated with the original anger. Stores were damaged in Koreatown. where many merchants had already developed tense relationships with Black and Latino customers. Korean-American shopkeepers faced a crisis of their own. Some had invested their savings and family labour into small businesses in neighbourhoods abandoned by larger companies. They often worked long hours and lived outside the area. Many believed police had failed to protect them as looting spread toward their stores. Some merchants armed themselves and stood on rooftops or behind counters. Television images showed Korean Americans holding rifles while smoke rose around them. Those images later became symbols of both self-defense and racial division. The situation did not fit a simple story of one community attacking another. Black residents had legitimate anger over mistreatment in some stores and over the sentence given to Soon Ja-do after she killed Latasha Harlins. Korean merchants had legitimate fear of robbery, arson, injury, and the loss of businesses built through years of work. Neither community had created the larger conditions that placed them in conflict. They met across counters in neighbourhoods shaped by disinvestment. One group often owned businesses because other economic opportunities were limited. The other entered those businesses as customers, while feeling that ownership and local wealth remained outside its control. Language differences and fear increased suspicion. During the unrest, that tension became visible through shattered windows, gunfire, and burning stores. Latino residents were also deeply involved in the events, though early media coverage often described the uprising mainly as a conflict between black residents, white police, and Korean merchants. By 1992, South Central was no longer exclusively or even uniformly black. Latino immigration had changed the population of many neighbourhoods. Latino residents participated in the unrest in different roles as protesters, looters, victims, workers, shop owners, witnesses, and people simply trying to return home. Federal immigration agents later participated in enforcement sweeps, and undocumented residents faced arrest and possible deportation, in addition to the dangers shared by everyone in the affected areas. The events were therefore not one racial confrontation. They were a regional breakdown shaped by several overlapping histories. By the second day, the scale exceeded what local police could manage. The California National Guard was mobilized. State and federal law enforcement personnel entered the city. President George H.W. Bush eventually sent federal troops and federalized guard forces after requests from California and Los Angeles officials. Soldiers stood at intersections and guarded buildings. Military vehicles moved along city streets. For residents who had spent years hearing their neighbourhoods compared to war zones, the comparison now became physical. Uniformed troops carrying rifles stood near grocery stores, gas stations, and apartment buildings. Checkpoints and curfews restricted movement. Helicopters remained overhead. Smoke obscured parts of the sky. The deployment helped restore order, but it did not happen instantly. Guard units faced delays involving equipment, ammunition, transportation, and coordination. Local police, state authorities, and federal forces had to establish command arrangements, while the emergency was already underway. During those delays, buildings continued burning. The unrest lasted several days and spread across a large area of Los Angeles County. Contemporary counts differed slightly as investigations continued, but the toll commonly reported soon afterward included 53 deaths, more than 2,300 injuries, approximately 17,000 arrests, and damage to more than 1,000 structures. Economic losses approached or exceeded hundreds of millions of dollars, with many later estimates placing the total near $1 billion. The numbers were large enough to become difficult to imagine. One damaged building could represent the savings of an entire family. One closed market could leave several blocks without a nearby place to buy food. One death could alter several generations of a household. The destruction did not fall only on large companies capable of rebuilding. Small stores, workshops, restaurants, pharmacies, and neighborhood businesses were damaged or destroyed. Employees lost jobs because their workplaces no longer existed. Owners discovered that insurance did not cover every loss. families who had not participated in the unrest paid its cost. A resident who had opposed the violence still woke without a grocery store. A child who had never entered a gang still walked past burned buildings on the way to school. A worker who had stayed home during the unrest could discover that the business employing him had been destroyed. The smoke eventually cleared, but clearing smoke was easier than rebuilding trust. Politicians visited the damaged areas. Television crews interviewed residents. Committees announced plans. Public officials promised investment, employment, police reform, and economic recovery. The language sounded familiar. After Watts in 1965, investigators had identified unemployment, poor housing, inadequate education, weak transportation, and hostile police-community relations. Nearly 27 years later, many of the same conditions appeared in explanations of the 1992 uprising. Residents had reason to doubt that another report would change daily life. Rebuilding programs were announced under names intended to communicate urgency and unity. Rebuild LA, led initially by businessman Peter Ueberroth, sought private investment and job creation. Corporations made commitments. Public agencies offered loans, assistance, and redevelopment plans. Some money entered the area. Some businesses reopened. Some promised investments never reached the scale residents expected. Projects moved slowly, changed direction, or produced jobs that did not provide the stability lost through earlier industrial decline. A burned building could be cleared in weeks. An economic system could not be rebuilt that quickly. The police department also entered a period of reform. Chief Darrell Gates retired in 1992. Willie L. Williams, previously police commissioner in Philadelphia, became the first black chief of the LAPD. The Christopher Commission's findings increased pressure for changes in discipline, supervision, recruitment, and community relations. The federal government prosecuted the officers involved in the Rodney King beating under civil rights law. In 1993, 2 officers, Stacey Kuhn and Lawrence Powell, were convicted, while 2 others were acquitted. The federal convictions provided a measure of accountability, but they did not erase the state verdict or the uprising that followed it. Rodney King himself became a public symbol larger than the complicated person behind it. During the unrest, he appeared before reporters and asked whether people could get along. The line was repeated because it sounded simple. The history surrounding it was not. Getting along required more than asking angry people to become calm. It required police officers to believe they could enforce the law without humiliating residents. It required residents to believe reporting a crime would not expose them to retaliation or abuse. It required economic institutions to provide alternatives to illegal markets. None of those conditions could be created through one appeal. A less visible development was occurring among some Crip and Blood sets. Before and around the time of the uprising, gang members and community mediators had been discussing peace. The scale and timing differed across neighbourhoods, and no agreement represented every set. The most recognised effort became the Watts Gang truce involving groups associated with housing developments, including Imperial Courts, Jordan Downs, Nickerson Gardens, and other nearby areas. The agreement drew inspiration from earlier peace efforts and was formalised in 1992. A later California legislative analysis described the Watts Treaty as an agreement between Crips and Bloods signed about a month after the unrest, with thousands of gang members participating in peace accords across the state over time. The truce was remarkable, precisely because the gangs had no central authority. Participants could speak for their own neighbourhoods and influence people they knew. They could not command every Crip or Blood set in Los Angeles. A peace agreement in Watts did not automatically settle a rivalry near Crenshaw, Compton, or another part of South Central. Even within participating neighbourhoods, not every member accepted the agreement. Still, the truce proved that gang warfare was not unavoidable. Young men who had inherited rivalries could decide not to continue them. People who had lost friends and relatives could meet with former enemies. Community organisers, clergy, Former gang members and local residents could create lines of communication before rumours produced retaliation. The peace was imperfect. Some shootings continued. Personal arguments and drug disputes did not disappear. Younger members did not always follow older participants. Police operations sometimes disrupted meetings or treated truce organisers as suspects rather than partners. The agreements also lacked the financial support required to create lasting alternatives. Gang members could stop shooting for a period, but they still needed jobs, housing, education, treatment, and a way to resolve disputes. A ceasefire without economic change placed an enormous burden on individuals to maintain peace, while the conditions surrounding them remained largely unchanged. Government agencies often preferred suppression programs because their results appeared measurable. Officers could count arrests, weapons, warrants, and drug seizures. Peacework was harder to measure. A mediator preventing a retaliation produced no crime scene, no arrest report, and no television footage. Success looked like nothing happening. That made it easier to overlook. The truce nevertheless contributed to a larger shift in how some communities approached violence. Former gang members increasingly worked as intervention specialists. They used relationships that police did not have. They could enter hospitals after shootings, speak to grieving relatives, correct false rumours, and ask people to delay retaliation. Their credibility came from experience. A young man who refused to speak with an officer might listen to someone who had grown up in the same housing development and survived the same conflicts. Law enforcement officials did not always trust these workers because some retained relationships with active gang members. Those relationships were exactly what made the intervention possible. The city would take years to accept the idea that public safety could involve people who were neither police officers nor conventional social workers. Violence began declining during the 1990s, but no single cause explains why. The gang truce mattered in some neighbourhoods. Changes in drug markets mattered. Crack use stopped expanding at the extraordinary pace seen during the 1980s. Some major dealers were imprisoned or killed. Gang members who had survived the worst years grew older and became less willing to fight over the same disputes. Demographic changes mattered. Economic improvement during the later 1990s created more employment. Policing changed. The prison system removed large numbers of offenders from the streets, though incarceration also damaged families and neighbourhoods. Emergency medical care improved, allowing some gunshot victims to survive wounds that might previously have been fatal. Community organisations continued working in ways that rarely received national attention. National research on youth gang homicide found a decline from the early to middle 1990s, with Los Angeles accounting for nearly 30% of the national decrease measured between 1991 and 1996 in the surveyed cities. Los Angeles still reported 173 gang homicides in 1998, showing that the problem remained severe even after substantial improvement. A falling homicide rate did not mean the damage had ended. A person released from prison returned to a neighbourhood where employers rejected criminal records. Children who had lost parents or siblings carried the effects into adulthood. Survivors lived with injuries, fear, and memories triggered by car engines, helicopters, and sudden noises. Empty lots remained where businesses had burned. Families moved away. Other families arrived, changing the language, culture, and population of South Los Angeles. The name South Central itself became politically uncomfortable because it was associated nationally with riots, gangs, crack, and violence. In 2003, the Los Angeles City Council officially replaced it with South Los Angeles in city usage. Changing the name could not change the history. Residents continued to debate what the uprising should be called. A riot emphasized destruction, looting, and violence. A rebellion emphasized resistance to injustice. An uprising allowed room for protest, anger, criminal acts, political meaning, and social breakdown. No single word contains everything that happened. Calling it only a riot can remove the years of police abuse, economic inequality, racial conflict, and frustration preceding it. Calling it only a rebellion can minimise the suffering of people beaten, killed, robbed, or left without businesses and jobs. The event was both political and destructive. It was produced by legitimate grievances and included acts that harmed innocent people. History does not become more honest by choosing only the part that feels comfortable. The same is true of the gang wars. It would be inaccurate to describe gang members only as victims of poverty and segregation. Individuals committed murders, robberies, assaults, intimidation, and drug crimes. Families suffered because of choices made by people who lived near them. It would also be inaccurate to describe the violence as the natural behaviour of a community. Most residents never joined gangs. The conflicts grew inside neighbourhoods shaped by housing discrimination, employment loss, weak institutions, aggressive policing, and limited political power. The individuals were responsible for what they did. The city was responsible for the environment it helped create, and then failed to repair. These truths can exist together. By the end of the 1990s, Los Angeles was no longer experiencing the same level of crisis that had defined the previous decade. Homicides and gang killings had declined. Some streets became safer. Children played outside in places where parents had once kept them indoors. The improvement was real. It was also uneven. Certain neighbourhoods continued to experience concentrated violence. Gang names remained on walls and in family histories. Old rivalries could return after a single shooting. The availability of firearms meant that a brief argument still had the potential to kill several people. The ceasefires required maintenance. People had to continue making calls, holding meetings, visiting hospitals, and speaking with younger members who had no memory of how the earlier wars began. The conflict had lasted long enough to become tradition. Ending it required people to challenge the idea that tradition deserved loyalty. That work rarely looked dramatic. A former gang member drove across a neighbourhood to correct a rumour. A mother asked a group of young men not to gather outside her house. A pastor allowed rivals to meet in a church. A teacher persuaded a student to remain in school. A police officer chose conversation instead of humiliation during a street stop. None of these actions ended violence across Los Angeles. Each prevented one more reason for it to continue. That may be the most useful way to understand what happened after the smoke cleared. Los Angeles did not wake one morning and discover that the war was over. The city moved away from its worst years through thousands of decisions made by residents, gang members, officers, organisers, parents, teachers, doctors, and people whose names never entered the historical record. Some decisions failed. Some reforms arrived too late. Some promises were forgotten as soon as the television cameras left. The people living there continued anyway. They reopened stores, they repaired houses, they buried relatives, they attended court hearings and police commission meetings, they organised peace walks and youth programmes. They raised children on streets known nationally for violence, while insisting that the neighbourhood was more than its reputation. Los Angeles had been described as a battlefield because territory was contested and gunfire shaped daily movement. Yet a battlefield normally empties when the fighting ends. South Central never emptied. It remained a home. The front yards, schools, churches, markets, parks and apartment buildings did not belong only to the gangs that claimed them or to the police units sent to control them. They belonged to the people who cooked dinner there, waited for buses there, watched children there, and returned each evening even when the rest of the city preferred to look away. The fires of April 1992 made that part of Los Angeles impossible to ignore for several days. The harder history is what happened when the smoke disappeared from television. Families remained, the inequalities remained, the memories remained. So did the effort to build a life in the same place where so many people had been told that life was cheap. That effort did not produce one final victory, one permanent truce, or one reform that solved everything. It produced quieter streets than before. For those who remembered the late 1980s and early 1990s, quiet was not an abstract idea. It meant a car could slow near the house without everyone moving away from the windows. It meant a child could walk to school without memorizing every gang boundary. It meant a mother could hear the telephone ring after dark and not immediately prepare herself for the worst. The change was incomplete, but it was real. And in neighborhoods where survival had once depended on reading every movement outside the front door, even an ordinary evening could feel like evidence that history had begun moving in another direction.